One man with nothing but love for his daughter, one woman who trusted no one on earth, and a night flight that would change everything, or destroy everything. When she fell asleep on his shoulder, he had no idea the woman beside him was carrying evidence that could bring down a multi-million-dollar empire. And he had no idea that someone nearby was watching, calculating, waiting. One small act of kindness on a late-night flight was about to make Mason Carter the target of a scheme he never saw coming. Stay with me until the end. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The gate was already boarding when Mason found it. Gate 14B. He had actually run, from the far end of Terminal C, his left hand gripping the handle of a worn, rolling carry-on that squeaked every third rotation, his right hand wrapped tight around Sophie's small fingers. She was keeping up, barely, her pink sneakers slapping the polished airport floor in quick, uneven steps that matched her breathing. "Dad?" she managed between breaths. "Are we going to make it?" "We're going to make it," he said, and he said it the way he said everything to her, with a certainty he didn't entirely feel but refused to surrender. The woman at the gate counter looked up when they reached her, the expression on her face hovering somewhere between sympathy and mild irritation. Mason shoved the boarding passes across the desk, paper, printed at home that morning because his phone screen was cracked badly enough that airport scanners never read it right on the first try. "Carter," he said. "Mason and Sophie." The woman scanned them without ceremony. 2 beeps. She tore the stubs and handed them back. "Last row," she said. "You'll need to check the carry-on. It has her medication in it." A pause. "Sir, overhead space is full." "Her medication," Mason repeated, quieter, and something in how he said it, not aggressive, just exhausted in a way that left no room for argument, made the woman look at Sophie for the first time. The girl was 8 years old and looked younger. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had no business being on the face of a child that age. "Keep it under the seat," the woman said, and waved them through. They walked down the jetway with 30 seconds to spare. Mason had booked the cheapest seats on the flight. That was not a decision. It was a mathematical reality. The appointment in Seattle had cost him 4 months of advance saving. Dr. Nathaniel Reeves was not a name you walked in on. He was a name you spent months getting a referral to, months convincing an insurance case manager to even acknowledge, and then spent the remaining savings to actually reach. Pediatric cardiology at that level did not come cheap, and it did not come close. You traveled to it, or your kid didn't get the care. So the seats were in the last row, directly in front of the lavatory. The hum of the aircraft systems was loudest back there. The seats didn't recline. A small placard on the tray table explained this with an apology that felt genuinely hollow. Sophie didn't complain. She never complained about things like seat location. She settled in beside the window, tucked her stuffed rabbit, a ragged gray thing she'd named Pepper when she was 4 and had never stopped calling Pepper, under her arm, and pressed her nose briefly to the cold oval glass. "You can see the whole runway," she said. "Yeah?" "All the lights. They go all the way out." Mason got the carry-on wedged under the seat in front of him, a process that required 3 attempts and cost him a knuckle against the seat rail. He sat back and looked at his daughter, who was watching the runway lights with the specific quiet concentration she reserved for things that she found genuinely beautiful and didn't want to disturb with words. He thought, as he often did when he watched her like this, about how much she looked like her mother. He didn't let himself stay in that thought long. He had learned in the 18 months since Claire had died that you couldn't stay in those thoughts long. You could visit them. You had to visit them. But you couldn't live there because there were things that needed doing in the living world, and the most important one was sitting next to him with a stuffed rabbit and her face against the glass. "You hungry?" he asked. "I brought the crackers you like." "The ones with the cheese in the middle?" "Yeah." "Maybe later." She pulled back from the window and looked at him. "Dad, do you think Dr. Reeves is going to be nice?" "I think he's going to be very smart," Mason said carefully, "which is more important than nice." Sophie considered this with a gravity that was somehow both adult and entirely childlike. "Can he be both?" "Probably. Most people are, if you give them a minute." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the window. The plane had begun to push back from the gate. Mason leaned his head against the headrest and closed his eyes. He was not going to sleep. He hadn't slept more than 4 or 5 hours in a single stretch and longer than he could accurately remember, but he closed his eyes for a moment because sometimes that was enough. Just darkness. Just the absence of things requiring his immediate attention. The seat beside him, the aisle seat, had been empty when they boarded. It was not empty for long. Tep. He heard her before he saw her. A quick, soft exchange between a flight attendant and a passenger. Something about a bag that needed to be stowed quickly. The flight attendant's voice carrying that particular blend of professionally warm and genuinely rushed. Then the sound of someone settling into the seat beside him. A soft exhale. The rustle of what sounded like a cashmere scarf being unwound from around a neck. Mason opened his eyes. The woman sitting next to him was, his brain, running on too little sleep and too much low-grade anxiety, delivered the assessment without editorial comment. Striking. Not beautiful in the way that announced itself immediately, but striking in a way that accumulated. Dark hair pulled back from her face in something that had probably been a neat arrangement that morning and was now only technically still a bun. Eyes that were, when she glanced briefly in his direction before looking away, the specific gray-green of deep water. A dark blazer over a cream blouse. The blazer slightly wrinkled in the way that suggested it had been worn through a long day rather than pulled fresh from a garment bag. She was holding a small scarf, silk or something close to it, deep burgundy with a narrow gold border, in her hands. She wrapped it twice around what looked like a small thumb drive-sized object, tucking the bundle into the outer pocket of the personal item bag she'd slid beneath the seat in front of her. Her hands were not steady when she did this. She caught him not quite looking, and he looked away first, which was the honest thing to do. "Sorry," she said. "I know that was a production." She meant the boarding, the last-minute arrival, the bag situation. "No problem," Mason said. "We barely made it ourselves." She glanced past him at Sophie, who had turned from the window to examine the new arrival with the frank, unfiltered curiosity that 8-year-olds consider entirely appropriate. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," the woman said. She seemed slightly surprised, as though she had been somewhere else entirely, and Sophie's voice had pulled her back. "I'm Sophie, that's my dad. We're going to see a heart doctor." Mason felt the familiar small flinch, not at Sophie saying it, but at the specific way the words sounded when they were just said plainly, like that, without cushioning. A heart doctor. Like it was a normal errand. "Sophie Pesha," he said, not as a reprimand, just her name. "What?" She looked at him with total sincerity. "We are." The woman had composed something that was not quite a smile, but was warm in its way. She paused, so briefly Mason might have imagined it, "Victoria, and I hope your appointment goes well." "Thank you," Sophie said with a small formal nod that she'd recently developed and deployed in situations she deemed significant. "It's important." "I can tell," Victoria said. She turned to face forward then, and something in the set of her shoulders told Mason she was done with conversation. Not rudely. There was nothing rude in it, but with the finality of someone who had very limited resources left and was conserving what remained. He understood that feeling precisely. He lived in it. He pulled out the crackers for Sophie, the small bag of pretzels the flight attendant had offered, and a book about ocean animals that Sophie had chosen at the library branch 3 blocks from their apartment. She read it for 20 minutes with the same complete attention she gave everything she decided mattered, then asked him if anglerfish felt lonely. "I don't think they have the brain for lonely," he said. "That's either really sad or really lucky," she said, turning the page. The cabin lights dimmed around 9:30. The flight attendants collected the last of the trash and retreated to the galley. Somewhere toward the front of the aircraft, a baby cried for 11 minutes and then stopped. The man across the aisle from Mason began to snore. Sophie fell asleep with Pepper held to her chest and the ocean book open across her knees. Mason reached over and closed it gently without waking her. He sat in the dark and listened to the engines and thought about money, which was not a productive thing to think about, but which arrived reliably every time he had nothing immediate to occupy his hands. The appointment, The copay they'd told him about and the additional costs they hadn't told him about yet. The refrigerator that had been making a grinding sound for 3 weeks that he kept ignoring. His truck's registration was due. His sister had offered money, and he had said no because accepting it felt like the last wall coming down. He was still working through the arithmetic of all of it when he felt the slight shift in weight beside him. He turned his head slowly. Victoria had fallen asleep. It had happened at some point in the last 15 minutes without announcement. Her head had tilted, then tilted further, and now rested on his shoulder with the specific, complete trust of unconscious bodies, which have no awareness of appropriateness or context or personal space. Her breathing had evened out. Whatever had been making her hands unsteady when she boarded had been temporarily overruled by sheer exhaustion. She was out completely. Mason sat very still. His first instinct was to shift, a small, deliberate movement, enough to stir her and let her wake on her own terms without the embarrassment of being directly told. That was the clean response, the logical one. She would wake up, realize what had happened, probably apologize, and they would both pretend the last few minutes hadn't occurred. He didn't do it. He was not entirely sure why. He was careful about this in his own head, because he had learned to be careful about that kind of thing. It wasn't anything other than what it appeared to be. She was exhausted. That much had been visible from the moment she sat down. And she had found rest, the way exhausted people sometimes find it when they finally stop moving, without choosing the moment or the location. The shoulder of a stranger on a night flight. He thought about Sophie, who also slept that way sometimes, completely, without reservation, in the total belief that the world would hold her steady. He didn't move. He sat with his neck at a slight angle that was already beginning to ache, and he didn't move. That was all. Across the aisle, one row back, a man was watching. His name, the name on his boarding pass, which was a real name but also one he preferred to use in situations like this one, situations that required a certain operational detachment, was Gerald Whitmore. He was 53 years old, dressed in the specific way of men who want to be taken for successful without appearing to try. Navy blazer. No tie. Watch that was visibly expensive but not ostentatiously so. He had recognized Victoria Hale before she sat down. That had not been part of the plan exactly. The plan had involved her being met in Seattle, not this. But plans in Gerald's experience were starting points. What mattered was adaptability. He watched the CEO of Hale Meridian sleep on the shoulder of a man who was clearly not anyone she knew. He watched the man's deliberate stillness. And he watched, with the particular quality of attention that operates on multiple tracks simultaneously, the bag beneath her seat, the outer pocket, the shape of something small wrapped in silk. Gerald Whitmore had spent 4 months working toward a specific goal, removing Victoria Hale from the company she had built from the seed money her late father had left her. He had the votes lined up, almost. He had the legal instruments drafted. He had the allies in place. What he did not have, and what had been making him increasingly careful, was the one thing standing between him and everything he had arranged, whatever was on that drive. Victoria had told no one she had it, but Gerald had people in positions who noticed things. A CFO's assistant who overheard a phone call. A building security guard who logged late-night access times. Small pieces. And when enough small pieces accumulated, you stopped needing to know the whole picture because the outline was clear enough. She had evidence. She was transporting it herself, physically, because she didn't trust digital transfer. And it was in that bag. He waited. The cabin was dark. The passengers around him were asleep or in headphones or staring at the small screens on the seatback in front of them. The flight attendants were in the galley. The man beside Victoria had not moved in 40 minutes. Gerald reached out slowly, extended his foot into the aisle, and nudged the bag. Just a test, to see how deeply she slept. She didn't move. The man beside her didn't look up. Gerald leaned forward slightly as though stretching, and his hand found the strap of the bag. A gentle tug. The bag slid half an inch. The outer pocket, which Victoria had closed with a simple zipper. Not a lock, just a zipper, because who locks their bag in their own seat, was 4 inches from his reach. He waited another 30 seconds. The bundle wrapped in the silk scarf was small enough that its absence might not be noticed immediately. In the dark. On a night flight. when the person it belonged to was deep asleep on a stranger's shoulder. He could be back in his seat before she stirred. He reached, but the plane had other ideas. Turbulence arrived without the courtesy of the seatbelt light. A sudden drop and shudder that sent overhead bins rattling and knocked a cup from someone's tray table 6 rows up. Gerald's hand snapped back. Several passengers gasped. A child toward the middle of the plane cried out, the startled cry of someone jolted out of sleep. Victoria's head lifted from Mason's shoulder. Mason's hand had moved, instinctively, without conscious decision, to brace the seat back in front of him and angle his body slightly between the movement of the aircraft and the woman who had been sleeping against him. Not a dramatic gesture, just the reflexive shift of someone who had spent 8 years making sure that things that could hurt the people around him didn't. Victoria blinked, located herself, processed where her head was and where it had been. "Oh." Her voice was still blurred with sleep. She pulled back, a quick movement, and for a moment her face showed something unguarded. Embarrassment, yes, but beneath it something closer to vulnerability, the exposed feeling of having been seen without permission. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I'd—" "It's fine," Mason said. He meant it plainly, without the reassurance voice, which was why it registered. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time, without the preoccupying static of everything she'd been carrying when she boarded. She absorbed this in pieces, younger than she'd assumed. Tired in the specific way of people who have been tired so long they've stopped noticing it as a distinct condition. There was a child asleep against his other side. He had positioned himself during the turbulence without thinking to keep both of them from being thrown forward. "I really am sorry," she said again, and this version of the apology meant something slightly different than the first one. He seemed to understand the difference. "Don't be," he said. "You needed sleep." The turbulence settled. The seatbelt light came on, 4 seconds late to be useful. An automated chime sounded. "Is your daughter okay?" Victoria asked. Mason glanced at Sophie, who had somehow slept through all of it, Pepper still tucked under her arm, head against the window. "She sleeps like a rock," he said. "Inherited it from her mom." Past tense. Victoria registered it without commenting on it, which was the right thing to do. The cabin lights were still dim. Gerald Whitmore, 1 row back and across the aisle, had straightened in his seat and was looking at the screen in front of him with a focused attention that was entirely manufactured. His expression revealed nothing. Victoria reached down to check her bag, and that was the moment she noticed. The outer pocket was unzipped. She knew she had zipped it. She remembered the specific small motion, the way the slider had caught briefly and then gone smooth, because she had checked it twice, because the contents of that pocket mattered more than almost anything she could name. Her hand went in. The drive was there, still wrapped in the scarf. But the scarf was different, rearranged, the wrapped end facing the wrong direction, the fold not as she had made it. Someone had touched it. Her blood ran cold in the very specific way it does when a fear that you had been carefully managing suddenly becomes concrete. She sat up straighter, her eyes moved. Not obviously, not in the way that would telegraph the movement to someone watching, across the seats within reach of her bag. The man 1 row back with the navy blazer. She had seen him before. She thought she had seen him before. Not close. In a parking garage or a lobby or... The specific context wouldn't surface, but the face was wrong in the way that faces you've been trained by bad experience to notice are wrong. She looked at Mason. He was watching her with an expression that was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who has noticed that something is wrong and is waiting to understand whether they are part of the problem or simply present for it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." She zipped the pocket. Her hands were steadier than they'd been when she boarded, which surprised her. Fury, she had learned over the years, had a stabilizing effect. She did not say anything else, but she did not take her hand off the bag. The flight landed in Seattle at 11:14 p.m., 20 minutes behind schedule, under a sky that was solid cloud from horizon to horizon, and a light rain that had been falling long enough that it no longer seemed like an event and simply seemed like the weather's natural state. Mason woke Sophie with a gentle hand on her shoulder and said her name twice in the way that she'd always needed, once to start the process, once to complete it. "We here?" she murmured. "We're here, Bug." She straightened up, located Pepper, and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. "Is it raining?" "Always," he said. She accepted this philosophically. Victoria was already up, bag in hand, scarf now tied around her wrist in a way that was deliberate and not casual at all. She had not spoken again during the descent. She had sat with the particular alertness of someone running threat assessments, which was not an expression Mason knew how to name, but which he had recognized in a general way as the presence of someone dealing with something real. "Good luck," she said to Sophie as they began to move toward the jet bridge, "with the appointment." Sophie, who was still partially asleep and therefore operating with a reduced filter, said, "Thank you. I hope whatever you're worried about gets better too." Victoria looked at her. "Perceptive kid," she said to Mason. "Always has been," he said. They stepped into the jet bridge. The crowd of deplaning passengers moved around them in the shuffling, slightly bleary mass that all-night flights produce. Mason kept one hand on Sophie's shoulder and the carry-on rolling ahead of them. Behind them, Gerald Whitmore moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades navigating rooms where the stakes were high and the exits were limited. He was not finished, and the night, which had been long enough already, was about to get considerably longer. The terminal at that hour had the half-lit quality of a place between states, not closed, not fully open, operating in the maintenance mode of the very late and the very early. The shops were shuttered, the moving walkways hummed. A cleaning crew moved methodically along the far wall with machines that smelled like industrial lemon. Mason stopped to look at the signs for ground transportation. Sophie leaned against his arm. "The hotel's close?" she asked. "Real close," he said, which was true if you accepted real close as a relative term for a $40 cab ride to the cheapest hotel he'd found within 3 miles of the hospital. He did not explain the full math. Behind them, he heard the voice first. It was loud, calibrated to carry. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising volume, which meant when he did raise volume, it was on purpose. Someone should check that man's bag. Mason turned. Gerald Whitmore was standing 12 feet away, his posture arranged in the specific configuration of concerned citizen. Around him, several travelers who had been walking past had slowed. Across the terminal, a young man in an airport security uniform, not TSA, just ground-level airport staff, had looked up from whatever he'd been doing near a pillar. Victoria stood 4 feet away, equally turned, her eyes going between Whitmore and Mason with an expression that Mason could not read. "I saw him go through her bag," Whitmore said, and he made his voice carry the exact right amount of reluctant authority, as though he hated to say it but had been left no choice. "While she was asleep. It needs to be checked." The words hit the air and rearranged the physics of the moment. Mason felt it in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the sick recognition of a situation that has tilted against you before you've understood why. He had lived 43 years as a man who looked nothing like a threat to anyone, and he knew the way you know structural things, not because you've analyzed them, but because you've survived them, that the knowledge of his own innocence would not be the first thing anyone in this terminal reached for. Sophie's hand tightened on his arm. She had heard. She looked up at him with eyes that were completely awake now, all traces of sleep gone. There was no panic in them. There was something that was trying hard not to be panic, which was worse to see. "Dad," she said quietly. "It's okay," he said. Same voice as the boarding gate, same specific certainty he didn't entirely feel. The airport security officer had crossed the terminal and was now standing close enough to be part of the situation. "Sir," he said, "can I ask you to step over here for a moment?" Mason looked at Victoria. She was looking at Whitmore. Her expression had gone entirely unreadable, the way some people's faces go when they are thinking faster than they want anyone to see. "This is ridiculous," Mason said. Not loud, not aggressive, just flat, because that was what it was. "Sir, it'll only take a minute." "He protected her bag," Sophie said. Everybody looked at her. She was 8 years old and standing in an airport at midnight with shadows under her eyes and a stuffed rabbit under her arm. And she said it again, louder, because she was the daughter of a man who didn't flinch, and she had decided that the moment required it. He protected her bag. I was watching. He didn't touch anything. In the suspended moment that followed, Mason looked at his daughter, and something happened in his chest that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with who she was becoming. Whitmore recovered first. "The child is 8 years old," he said smoothly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than contempt. "She was asleep." "I woke up during the turbulence," Sophie said. "I saw you." She pointed. Not at Mason, not at the security officer, at Gerald Whitmore. "I saw you lean forward," she said. "You reached." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Victoria Hale stood in the middle of it and checked her bag and looked at the outer pocket and said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked at Whitmore with an expression that had passed through several stages of something and come out the other side. "We need to find the security office," she said. "To no one in particular. To everyone present." "Victoria," Whitmore started. "Gerald." She said his name the way you say a word that reveals it's been the wrong word all along. "Don't." The rain continued outside. The moving walkways hummed. The cleaning crew moved down the far wall with their lemon-scented machines, oblivious to the specific disaster unfolding in their peripheral vision. And Mason Carter stood in the middle of it all, one hand on his daughter's shoulder, carry-on at his feet, thinking about a 7 a.m. appointment that they had crossed half the country to reach, and waiting for the world to sort itself out. It was going to be a very long night, but Sophie had seen, and Sophie had spoken. And some things, once said in a clear voice by an 8-year-old who has nothing to prove and nothing to hide, are very difficult to put back. They had made the flight. They had landed. They were standing on the ground in Seattle. Everything else was still undecided. Mason reached down without looking and took Sophie's hand, and she held on, and that was, for the moment, enough. The security office smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, and it was smaller than Mason had expected. A room that seemed designed to make everyone inside it feel slightly more cornered than the situation actually required. 2 molded plastic chairs against one wall. A desk with a monitor that had a yellow sticky note on the bezel. A single overhead fluorescent that flickered every 40 seconds with the reliability of a metronome. Mason had counted 6 flickers since they'd brought him in. Sophie sat beside him in one of the plastic chairs, Pepper in her lap, back straight, with the specific composure of a child who has decided that falling apart is not available to her right now. She was watching the security officer behind the desk, a man named Briggs, according to the badge clipped to his chest, with the steady, unblinking attention she normally reserved for things she was trying to understand from the outside in. Briggs was in his mid-40s, with the look of a man who had spent decades seeing the worst assumptions about people turn out to be correct, often enough that he'd stopped giving the benefit of the doubt as a first move. He wasn't unkind. He was tired and careful and operating inside a protocol that didn't leave much room for nuance at 11:30 at night in a half-empty terminal. "Mr. Carter," he said, not looking up from whatever he was filling out. "Can you walk me through the flight, specifically the period when the woman seated next to you was asleep?" "Her name is Victoria," Sophie said. Briggs looked up, looked at her, looked at Mason. "Sophie," Mason said. "Not a reprimand, just a placement." "She told us her name," Sophie said, which was factually correct and entirely beside the point, and she seemed to understand both of those things. Mason leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, hands loose, the posture of a man who has nothing to hide and has done this long enough to know that visible nervousness reads wrong regardless of its source. "She fell asleep on my shoulder," he said. "I didn't move because I didn't want to wake her. That's the full story. The man who made the report says he saw you access her bag. He's lying." Briggs wrote something. "Mr. Carter, I understand you have to be here, and I understand you have to ask," Mason said. "But I need you to understand something too. We have an appointment tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. at Harborview Medical, Pediatric Cardiology. We've been saving for this for almost a year." He said it without drama, without the particular tremor in the voice that people deploy when they want sympathy. Just fact, laid down flat. "If we're here past midnight, this becomes a problem." Briggs looked at Sophie again. Something shifted slightly in his expression, shape not much, but enough to see. I understand that, he said, but I still need to process this. Someone filed a report. Based on what he claims he saw, Mason said. Correct. From a seat that was across the aisle and one row behind mine, in a dark cabin, on a moving aircraft. Briggs didn't answer that directly. He wrote something else. In the hallway outside, visible through the narrow window in the door, Mason could see Gerald Whitmore standing with another security officer, his posture relaxed in the way of men who are comfortable in rooms where decisions are being made about other people. He was talking. He used his hands when he talked, controlled gestures, the kind you learn in boardrooms and on stages. Victoria was not visible. That bothered Mason in a way he hadn't expected. Not because he expected her to do anything in particular. She didn't owe him anything. They had exchanged a few sentences and shared a couple hours of proximity on a plane. That was the sum total of their relationship. But because Sophie had spoken up for her specifically, and the absence felt like something with weight. "Dad," Sophie said quietly. "Yeah." "She's not going to leave, is she?" He looked at her. "Who?" "Victoria." She said the name with the particular gravity of a child who has decided someone matters. "She's going to tell them what actually happened." Mason didn't answer right away. He thought about what he'd seen on Victoria's face in the terminal, the moment she'd said Gerald's name, the flatness in her voice when she'd said, "Don't." Something had been decided in that moment. He just didn't know yet which direction the decision pointed. "I think so," he said, which was honest. It was not the same as certain, but it was honest. Sophie nodded once and went back to watching Briggs. The fluorescent flickered. 7. Victoria was not in the hallway. She was in a second room down the corridor, smaller, with a table instead of a desk, which gave it the quality of an interrogation space that was trying not to look like one. She had asked for 5 minutes alone before speaking to anyone, and the officer who had escorted her there had agreed with the slightly surprised compliance that people sometimes extend to individuals who project authority without visibly trying to. She sat down, put her bag on the table in front of her, and pressed her palms flat against the surface. Her mind was running through the sequence with the precision of a woman who had built a company from a $60,000 inheritance and a business plan that 3 separate venture capitalists had called overambitious. She ran it like a log. What she knew, what she could prove, what she had assumed, and where the assumption might have been wrong. Gerald Whitmore had been on her flight. That was not coincidence. She had stopped believing in coincidence where Gerald was concerned approximately 6 months ago, around the time she'd found the first of the altered financial documents and started understanding the shape of what was being built around her. Gerald was meticulous. Gerald did not appear in the same airport as you by accident. He had known her itinerary, which meant someone on her team was still feeding him information, which meant the breach was deeper than she'd closed for. The drive was in her bag. She checked. It was there, wrapped in the scarf, the drive itself intact. She couldn't verify the data without a laptop, but the physical object was undamaged. The question was what he had been trying to do. Copy it, swap it, just confirm its existence and location? She didn't know. And not knowing bothered her more than most things. What she did know, with a certainty that had none of the ambiguity of the rest of it, was what the little girl had said. "I saw you lean forward. You reached," said in a child's voice with a child's directness, which meant without calculation, without the social architecture that adults build around inconvenient truths. Sophie had been awake during the turbulence. Sophie had seen, and the man, Mason, had not moved for an hour while she slept on his shoulder. She had woken with the turbulence and registered, even through the fog of interrupted sleep, the way his body had shifted to absorb the movement. Not toward her, between her and whatever came next. The unconscious positioning of someone whose instinct was to take the impact. She had spent a long time building walls around her own judgment about people. Partial walls, mostly. She was not naive enough to think the walls were complete, or even that they were the right response to the world. But she'd been burned badly enough, and recently enough, that the walls were load-bearing. She needed them to be. And yet, she took her phone out and found the number she needed. Her attorney, Catherine Marsh, who had told her 2 weeks ago to call at any hour if something broke. It was 2 a.m. in New York. Victoria called anyway. It rang 4 times. Then, "This had better be the drive?" Catherine's voice, fully awake despite the hour, which was one of the things Victoria paid her for. "It's better than the drive," Victoria said. "I have a witness, an 8-year-old who saw Gerald Whitmore attempt to access my bag on the flight, uncoached, unprompted, in front of airport security." A pause. "How credible?" "Completely." She said it without hesitation, which surprised her slightly. "She's 8. She doesn't have an angle." "Where are you?" "Seattle. Airport security office. Gerald is here too. He filed a complaint first, which tells you everything about how he operates." "Of course he did." Catherine's voice had the quality of controlled fury that lawyers develop when they've been outmaneuvered in a way they anticipated but couldn't prevent. "Okay, listen to me. Don't say anything about the drive's contents to anyone in that building. The chain of custody matters. If he's claiming you have evidence of—" "I know." "Victoria." "I know, Catherine. I've been doing this for 6 months." "You've been doing it scared for 6 months. There's a difference." A beat. "Are you scared right now?" Victoria thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'm angry." "Good. Angry is better. Angry wins cases." Catherine was already moving. Victoria could hear it in the background sounds, the shift of someone getting up, pulling things from a shelf. "I'm going to make some calls. Don't let them leave with Whitmore until I've spoken to someone. Can you stall?" "I can stall." "And the man they're questioning? The one Whitmore accused?" Victoria looked at the wall for a moment. "He didn't do anything," she said. "He spent an hour sitting still so I could sleep on his shoulder, and then he found me a scarf I didn't know I'd dropped." The silence on the other end had a quality to it. "That's not a thing people usually do," Catherine said. "No," Victoria said. "It isn't." She hung up and sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, stood, and went to find the security officer who had brought her here. The scarf had been on the floor. This was the detail that Mason hadn't mentioned yet, because no one had asked him the right question to surface it, and he was still processing where it fit. During the turbulence, the same jolt that had woken Victoria, that Sophie had apparently used as cover to open her eyes and observe the row behind them. Something had slipped from Victoria's bag. He had seen it in his peripheral vision, a slip of dark fabric, and had reached down and picked it up without thinking about it. He'd meant to hand it back when she woke. Then she had woken and been disoriented, and the conversation had moved in a different direction, and he'd kept it in his hand for another few minutes before she'd noticed the outer pocket, and her expression had changed. He had handed it to her then, without comment, because it was hers, and she'd needed it. In the sequence that Whitmore had described, man goes through woman's bag while she sleeps. The scarf was a central piece, a detail that could be spun either direction depending on who was doing the spinning. Mason was aware of this. He was not unaware of the way stories worked when they were pointed at someone. What he was also aware of, sitting in this chair under this flickering fluorescent light, was that being aware of the dynamics didn't change them. He was a 32-year-old single father in an airport security office at midnight with no lawyer, no witnesses except his 8-year-old daughter, no money to hire anyone, and a 7 a.m. appointment that was the entire point of the last 11 months of his life. He was aware of all of that. He was also aware that he had done nothing wrong, which under ideal circumstances would have been sufficient. These were not ideal circumstances. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said to Briggs. Briggs looked up, cautious in the way of adults who have learned that questions from children are sometimes the most inconvenient kind. "Sure." "If I saw something happen," Sophie said, "does it matter that I'm a kid? Like, legally?" "Sophie," Mason started. "I'm asking," she said, not dismissively, but with the patience of someone making a clarification. "Because he said it doesn't matter, the man outside. He said I was asleep and I'm only 8. She looked at Briggs directly. "But I wasn't asleep. And the age thing, that seems like something someone would say if they didn't want you to listen to what I'm saying." Briggs put down his pen. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had moved past careful into something closer to genuine. "Eyewitness accounts from minors are handled carefully," he said slowly, which was the technical answer. but they're not dismissed. Okay, Sophie said. Then I want to tell you what I saw. Sophie, Mason said. Dad. She turned to look at him with the specific expression that meant she had decided, and the decision was not reversible, and she needed him to understand that. I saw something and I'm going to say it. You taught me that. He had taught her that. He had told her, in the context of a completely different conversation about completely different things, about playground situations and small injustices and what it meant to tell the truth when it was inconvenient, that seeing something and staying quiet was its own kind of action. That silence was a choice like any other. She had filed it, she had kept it, and now she was pulling it out. He sat back. Okay, he said. Tell him. Tell? She turned back to Briggs, and, in the methodical, clear way she had learned from a father who believed in stating things plainly, and from a lifetime of being taken more seriously when she didn't rush, she told him exactly what she had seen. The man in the navy blazer, the way he had leaned forward during the turbulence, not startled by it, not bracing against it the way other passengers had, but using it. The reach. The snap back when the shuddering stopped. She described the angle of his arm, the position of his hand relative to the bag beneath Victoria's seat. She described it the way she would describe something she had watched happen, which was what it was. Briggs wrote for a long time. When he was done, he looked at her again. You're sure about what you saw? Yes, Sophie said. I don't say things I'm not sure about. My dad says that too. Briggs looked at Mason. Mason said nothing, because nothing needed saying, but... The corridor outside had gotten more complicated while Mason was inside. 2 more officers had appeared. A woman in a suit that wasn't a uniform had come through the main security door and was talking to Briggs's supervisor near the desk at the end of the hall. Something about jurisdiction and documentation, the kind of conversation that people have in official spaces when a situation is escalated past what the local mechanism was designed to handle. Whitmore was still there, but his posture had changed subtly. Not dramatically. Just slightly, the way a person shifts when the ground under them has moved without their permission. Victoria came out of the second room at the same moment Mason came out of the first. They stood in the corridor 4 feet apart, with the specific awareness of 2 people who have been in separate rooms being questioned about the same event and are now recombining in a space where everyone else can see them. She looked at him. He looked at her. Are you okay? She asked. She asked it like someone who actually wanted to know, which was different from how the question was usually deployed. We're fine, he said. Sophie told them what she saw. Something crossed Victoria's face. She didn't have to do that. No, she wanted to. He paused. She's that kind of kid. Victoria glanced through the doorway at Sophie, who was still inside talking to Briggs with the focused seriousness of someone giving congressional testimony. Victoria's expression did something complicated that she seemed to be only partially in control of. I should have said something sooner, she said. Not to him specifically, not to anyone in particular. Just said it into the air in front of her, the way people sometimes confess things to the space between themselves and the person they're talking to when they can't quite say it directly. When he made the accusation, I froze. I know what Gerald is capable of, and I know how he operates, and I still froze. That happens, Mason said. It shouldn't. Not to me. I run a... She stopped. It doesn't matter. I froze and your daughter was the one who spoke. Sophie tends to step in when there's a gap, he said. Been that way since she was 5. Gets it from her mother. She gets it from watching you, Victoria said. He didn't respond to that. Not because it didn't mean anything, but because it meant something he hadn't prepared for. Down the hall, Gerald Whitmore turned and saw them standing together, talking. His expression didn't change. He was too experienced for that. But his eyes moved between them with the specific quality of a man recalculating. Who is he? Mason asked. Quietly, because the hallway was not private. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Someone I trusted, she said, which tells you everything about my judgment. Or about his patience, Mason said. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him with the slightly startled expression of someone who has been handed a useful piece of thinking from an unexpected direction. "No," she said slowly. "They're not." Briggs appeared in the doorway. "Ms. He hesitated, and Mason realized then that she had given a different name at check-in, that whatever name was on her boarding pass was not the name Mason knew her by. Briggs cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're going to need to review the gate security footage. Given what—" He glanced at the doorway behind him, where Sophie was visible in the chair, still composed. "Given what the girl described, there are some things we need to verify before we can close this out." Whitmore heard. The sentence landed visibly, even from down the hall. "How long?" Mason asked. "I can't say for certain. An hour, maybe more." An hour past midnight. 7 a.m. appointment. He did the math without showing it. "Is there somewhere for my daughter to wait, somewhere she can lie down?" Briggs looked slightly pained, the look of a man operating inside a system that had not been designed with the comfort of 8-year-old bystanders as a design criterion. "I can find her something." "A chair she can stretch out on is fine," Mason said. "She's pretty adaptable." He went back in to tell Sophie. She accepted the information with the equanimity of someone who has spent her life adapting to plans that changed without warning, which was not a thing an 8-year-old should have had to develop, but which she had developed anyway, and with considerable grace. "Is she going to be okay?" Sophie asked. She meant Victoria. "I think she can take care of herself," Mason said. "But is she going to be okay?" He recognized the distinction. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Sophie lay down on the 2 chairs Briggs had pushed together, tucked Pepper under her head as a pillow, and closed her eyes with the faith of someone who has decided to let the adults handle the next part. Mason sat beside her and put his hand on her back, the weight of it steady, the way he'd done since she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. The fluorescent light above them continued its 40-second flickering. He counted them because it was something to do. Papa. The footage, when they found the right angle and the right timestamp, was not dramatic. It was almost mundane in its clarity. A man reaching forward in a dark cabin, the turbulence providing cover, the motion of a hand toward a bag. The camera was mounted near the overhead bin, aimed at the aisle for exactly the reasons the footage now demonstrated. It was not designed to catch this specific thing. It caught it anyway. Briggs showed it to both of them separately. Mason first, because he was the one who'd been accused. Then Victoria, because she was the one whose property had been targeted. When Victoria came out of the room where they'd shown her the footage, she walked directly to the end of the hall where Whitmore was standing with his officer and said, in a voice that carried without effort, "I want to be very clear about something." Whitmore looked at her with an expression he had assembled carefully. "Victoria, you were on my flight," she said. "You had access to my itinerary, which means someone on my internal team gave it to you. You attempted to access my personal property during the flight, which is on camera. And then you filed a false report against a man who spent an hour sitting still so I could sleep." She let a beat pass. "You've been doing things like this for months, but this is the first time you've done it somewhere with cameras." "You're making accusations. I'm making observations," she said. "The accusations are the ones you filed, against him." She didn't look at Mason when she said it. She kept looking at Whitmore. "They're going to be withdrawn." "I don't think—" "Gerald." Her voice dropped slightly, which made it carry more. "I have the drive. I have footage. I have a witness who is 8 years old and made of honesty. And I have Catherine Marsh on the phone, which you should find concerning because you know what Catherine does for a living." She paused. "Withdraw it, now, while it's still a choice." Something moved behind Whitmore's eyes. A recalculation, the specific clicking motion of a man who has played enough high-stakes games to know when the board has turned. He was not a man who gave up gracefully. She had known him long enough to know that. But he was also a man who understood survival. And survival sometimes required releasing something you'd been holding on to so that you could run with your hands free. He said something quietly to the officer beside him. The officer nodded and went to find Briggs. Whitmore left without looking at Mason, without looking at Sophie, who had woken again and was sitting up in her improvised chairbed, watching the hallway with clear, steady eyes. Mason watched him go. He felt the particular release of a situation that has been pressing against you. Not a rush of relief, nothing so clean as that, just a very gradual reduction of pressure, like a sound you've been hearing so long you forgot it was there until it stopped. Victoria came to stand a few feet from where he was sitting beside Sophie. "It's done," she said. "The complaint is withdrawn. You're free to go." "Okay," he said. She seemed to have expected him to say more. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the part I played in it. I should have spoken first." "You spoke when it mattered. Sophie spoke first." "She does that," he said. Sophie, who was listening to all of this with her knees pulled to her chest and Pepper in her lap, said, "Are you going to be okay tonight? Do you have somewhere to go?" Victoria blinked. Yes, I have a hotel." "Okay." Sophie seemed to take a survey of the situation and make a decision. "You should eat something. You look like you haven't eaten." Victoria looked at the child for a long moment. Then she looked at Mason, and the expression on her face was something that had started out as the composed exterior of a CEO navigating a crisis, and had arrived somewhere considerably more human and less planned. "She's always like this?" Victoria asked. "Pretty much," Mason said. Outside the security office, the terminal was quieter than it had been. The cleaning crews had moved down past the gate areas. The overhead lighting had shifted to its reduced overnight mode, cooler and dimmer. In 2 hours, the early flights would start arriving, and the terminal would begin its slow return to full operational volume. But right now it held the particular stillness of an in-between hour. Mason gathered the carry-on and helped Sophie into her jacket. They had a cab to catch, and a hotel room that needed to be reached, and a 7 a.m. appointment that was now reachable again, barely, if they moved. At the door of the security corridor, he stopped and looked back. Victoria was still standing where he'd left her, her bag over her shoulder, the scarf, recovered, restored, tied again at her wrist, catching the light. She looked like a woman who had won something and was still working out what it had cost. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said to him." "Thank you," she said, "for the hour on the plane." He nodded once. She nodded back. Sophie waved, which was Sophie. They walked out into the terminal. The rain was still falling outside the glass walls in steady, indifferent sheets. The cab stand was 100 meters away. Sophie took his hand without being asked, and they walked toward the doors together, the carry-on squeaking every third rotation the way it always did. And the night outside was dark and wet and cold, and they were going to make the appointment. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The hotel room cost $64 a night, which was the cheapest Mason had found within reasonable distance of Harborview Medical, and it showed. The carpet had a pattern that might have been intentional or might have been years of accumulated staining arranged into something that only looked deliberate. The bathroom faucet ran cold for 90 seconds before warming up. The heater worked but made a sound like it resented the obligation. Sophie didn't complain. She never complained about hotels. She dropped her backpack on the bed nearest the window, kicked off her shoes without untying them the way she always did despite Mason's repeated and entirely futile requests that she not, and sat cross-legged on the bedspread with Pepper in her lap. "Do you think she's okay?" she asked. Mason set the carry-on against the wall and checked the lock on the door out of habit. "Who?" "Victoria." She said it like it was obvious because to her it was. "I think she's handled worse," he said. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it had the quality of being useful, which was sometimes what Sophie needed more than precision. "She didn't look like she had anyone with her," Sophie said. "Like anyone who was there for her, not just work people." He sat on the edge of the other bed and looked at his daughter. Sometimes she said things that required him to stop and recalibrate his understanding of how much she was actually absorbing about the world around her, and this was one of those moments. She was 8. She noticed the specific loneliness of having professionals instead of people. He wasn't sure he'd noticed that at 8. "She has her attorney," he said. "Catherine. She was on the phone." "That's a work person," Sophie said. He couldn't argue with the taxonomy. "Go to sleep," he said. "We have to be up in 4 hours." Sophie lay down without further debate, which told him she was more exhausted than she was letting on. She was asleep in 6 minutes. He knew because he watched her, the way he had watched her every night for 8 years. A habit that had started as pure parental vigilance and had evolved into something else. A form of gratitude, maybe, for every night that she was still there and still breathing and still herself. Her heart made a sound it shouldn't make when she was very still. He could hear it sometimes. Not always, not loudly, just a faint irregularity that the doctors had explained to him in careful language that he had spent a year and a half translating from clinical into real. What it meant was that her heart was working harder than it should to do what hearts were supposed to do without effort. What it meant was that this trip, this appointment, this man named Dr. Reeves they had never met but had built 11 months of hope around, was not optional. He sat in the chair beside her bed until 2:30, not sleeping, not quite awake, existing in the gray space between them that parents of sick children learn to inhabit without complaint because the alternative is falling apart. And falling apart is not on the schedule. At 2:30, he made himself lie down. At 6, he was already in the shower. At 6:45, they were in a cab. Harborview Medical Center from the outside looked like most large hospitals. A complex of connected buildings that had grown over decades in ways that were functional rather than planned. The newer sections cleaner and more angular, the older ones worn into a kind of institutional permanence. The morning was gray, the rain from the previous night reduced to a fine mist that was technically not precipitation, but got you wet anyway if you stood in it long enough. Sophie held his hand across the parking area. She was wearing the blue sweater with the small yellow stars on it that had been her favorite for 2 years, and her hair was in 2 imprecise braids that Mason had done himself that morning, with the focused determination of a man performing a task he had learned entirely by necessity. They were not perfect braids. They were braids. The cardiology department was on the 4th floor. The elevator smelled like antiseptic, and something that was trying to be a fresh scent and wasn't quite getting there. Sophie pushed the button for 4 because she always wanted to push the button, and Mason let her because he had learned which things to let her have. The waiting room was already occupied when they arrived. A couple in their 50s with a boy of about 12 who was reading something on a tablet, and a young woman alone in the corner with a paper coffee cup and the particular stillness of someone who has been in too many waiting rooms and has stopped expecting things to happen on time. Mason checked them in at the desk. The woman behind it asked for the insurance cards, the referral documentation, the intake forms he had completed and printed and placed in the exact same internal pocket of his bag, every time he touched the bag, so that he would know with certainty where they were. He produced them in order without being asked twice. Sophie sat in the chair beside him and read the ocean book, which she had brought in her backpack alongside Pepper, a granola bar she hadn't finished on the flight, and a small notebook with a purple cover in which she drew things she wanted to remember. At 7:20, a nurse called her name. The intake process took 40 minutes. Height, weight, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, a brief review of her history by a resident who was thorough without being warm, which was fine. Warmth was not the variable Mason was optimizing for. At 8:15, Dr. Nathaniel Reeves came into the examination room. He was older than Mason had imagined, somewhere in his mid-60s, lean, with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and the careful movements of a man who had learned to be precise after decades of being in rooms where precision mattered. His voice was quiet, not soft, not gentle in any performative way, just calibrated to a volume that didn't echo off the walls of a small room. He looked at Sophie first, not at the chart, not at Mason, at Sophie. "So," he said, pulling the rolling stool to a position that put him at her eye level, "you're the one who came all the way to Seattle." "My dad did too," she said. "Fair point." He glanced at the chart briefly, then back at her. "Does your heart ever feel like it's skipping? Like a word that gets left out of a sentence?" Sophie considered this. "Sometimes, when I've been running, or when I wake up really fast." "Does it scare you when it happens?" She thought about that longer. "A little, but then it stops." "Does it scare your dad?" Sophie looked at Mason. "He doesn't show it," she said. "But yeah." Reeves looked at Mason then, and Mason had the odd experience of being seen accurately by someone who had known him for approximately 30 seconds. "I'm going to do a full workup today," Reeves said, switching now to the register you use with adults without making the child feel excluded from the conversation. Echocardiogram, extended Holter monitor review, The imaging from her previous scans that you brought. I want to have a complete picture before I say anything definitive. He paused. I've reviewed the referral notes. There are things here I want to understand better before we talk about next steps. That's not alarm. It's thoroughness. Can you tell the difference? Yes, Mason said. Good. He turned back to Sophie. Do you have questions for me before we start? Sophie thought about it seriously. Will it hurt? The echo doesn't hurt at all. The monitor is just stickers. The blood draw, he made a small gesture, a so-so motion with one hand, is briefly unpleasant. On a scale of what? A bad paper cut. Sophie absorbed this. Okay, she said, I can do that. I know you can, Reeves said, and he said it without condescension, which was the right way to say it. The workup took most of the morning. Mason spent 2 hours in the waiting room while the tests ran, and in that 2 hours he drank 1 cup of coffee from the machine in the corner that tasted like hot disappointment, checked his phone 6 times without finding anything that required action, and stared at the middle distance with the specific vacancy of a man whose body has stopped moving but whose mind has not. His phone buzzed at 9:47. Unknown number. Seattle area code. He almost didn't answer. Then he did, because ignoring unknown numbers was a luxury he couldn't afford when Sophie had active medical processes happening. Mr. Carter. Not a question. A woman's voice, confident without being aggressive, the voice of someone who has conducted many phone calls with people who didn't know they were coming and has learned to establish the ground quickly. My name is Catherine Marsh. I'm Victoria Hale's attorney. I'm calling because Victoria asked me to, which is not something I typically do, call strangers on behalf of my clients, but she was specific about it. Mason straightened slightly in his chair. Okay. She wanted me to check that the situation at the airport last night didn't create any lingering issues for you. Documentation, follow-up, anything like that. We're fine, Mason said. Security closed it out. I have a copy of the incident report from Briggs, which shows the complaint was withdrawn and your name is clear. I'll email that to you if you give me an address, because having it is better than not having it. All right, he gave her the email address. One more thing. A pause, brief, the kind that precedes something that has been considered. Victoria would like to speak with you, at your convenience, today, if possible. She's in Seattle through tomorrow morning. Mason was quiet for a moment. About what? She'll tell you that herself, Catherine said. I'm just the messenger on this part. He thought about it, which took less time than he expected. Sophie's appointments run through early afternoon, after that. She'll make herself available whenever works. I'll give you a number. He wrote it on the back of the parking validation ticket from the night before, which was the only paper he had in his jacket pocket. Then he sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after hanging up, looking at the number. He thought about what Sophie had said. She didn't look like she had anyone with her, just work people. He thought about Catherine Marsh calling him because Victoria had asked her to, which was, as Catherine herself had noted, not a standard service. He put the phone back in his pocket and went back to waiting. Dr. Reeves found him at 12:15. Sophie was with him, walking beside the doctor with Pepper tucked under her arm and an adhesive bandage on the inside of her elbow where the blood draw had been, wearing the expression she wore after medical things, not distressed, just slightly inward, processing. Reeves was carrying a tablet with images on it that Mason recognized as echo stills from the way the gray and white shapes arranged themselves. They sat in a small consultation room off the main corridor, the 3 of them, with a box of tissues on the table that Mason had learned to ignore because acknowledging the tissues felt like agreeing to need them. Reeves turned the tablet toward him. Her heart has a structural irregularity, he said, that I want to be clear has been present since birth and is not new. The previous imaging shows it. What is new, or more accurately, what has become more relevant as she's grown, is that the irregularity is creating a workload issue. Her heart is compensating, and compensation works until it doesn't. Mason looked at the image. He had looked at versions of this image for 18 months, across 3 different specialists, and he understood enough to know what he was looking at even when he didn't understand the precise terminology. What does it mean for her? He asked. Specifically, Reeves looked at Sophie, who was looking at the image with that same earnest scientific attention she gave the ocean book. "Can I tell both of you at the same time?" he asked her. "Yes," she said. "I want to know." "Then here's what I'm seeing," Reeves said, and he explained it in two registers simultaneously. The technical for Mason, the honest for Sophie, with a skill that Mason recognized as something cultivated over a long career of having this specific kind of conversation. The short version was this. Sophie's heart had a valve that was working harder than it should. The long version involved a treatment approach, not surgery, not yet. A catheter-based procedure that was less invasive than what the previous specialists had suggested, combined with a medication protocol that Reeves wanted to adjust from what she was currently on. "It won't fix it permanently," Reeves said, "but it will significantly reduce the strain, and it gives us time to monitor whether the valve self-corrects as she continues to grow, which happens more often than people expect in cases like hers." "How much time?" Mason asked. "Monitored properly, with the procedure done in the next 3 to 6 months, I would expect her to be running and complaining about school by the time she's 9. He said it to Sophie, who received this information and appeared to conduct an internal referendum on the school complaining component. "I don't usually complain about school," she said. "Then you can make an exception." She smiled, which was small and tired but real, and Mason watched it happen and felt something in his chest that was not medical and would not show up on any scan. "The procedure," Mason said. "Can it be done here?" "I'm on staff here and at 2 other centers," Reeves said. "We'll talk about logistics separately. The priority right now is the medication adjustment. I'm going to write new orders today, and I need you to have a pharmacist review the transition carefully." But he made a note on the tablet. "You're going to have questions tonight. Write them down and call my office line tomorrow morning. Not the main desk. I'll give you the direct number." He said it matter-of-factly, the direct number offer, as if it were standard procedure, which Mason understood it probably wasn't, but which Reeves delivered without making it feel like a favor that required acknowledgement. They walked out of the consultation room and into the corridor, and Sophie immediately sat down on a bench against the wall with the look of someone who has been holding a great deal of weight upright for a great deal of time and has decided to set it down for a moment. Mason sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat there in the hospital corridor while the world moved around them in its ordinary, purposeful way. Nurses changing shifts, a cart of equipment going past, an intercom announcement about something happening somewhere else in the building. And Mason looked straight ahead and thought, for the first time in a long time, that they were going to be okay in a way that felt like something more than a promise he was making to himself to keep standing up. He still didn't know how he was going to pay for the procedure, but that was a different problem. That problem lived in a different room. This room, right now, contained his daughter leaning against his arm and a doctor who had told them something they could work with. "Dad?" Sophie said into his jacket. "Yeah. I'm glad we came." "Me too, Bug. Can we get food? I'm actually really hungry." He laughed. It came out rough and slightly fractured, the laugh of someone whose emotional architecture has been under pressure long enough that even relief doesn't come out quite clean. But it came out. "Yeah," he said. "Absolutely." He called the number Catherine had given him at 2 p.m. from a diner 2 blocks from the hospital where Sophie was working through a grilled cheese and a bowl of tomato soup with the focused appreciation of someone who has earned this meal specifically. Victoria picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Carter?" "Mason," he said. "How are you doing?" A pause that was shorter than he expected. "Better than last night, which isn't saying much, but it's something." She sounded different over the phone than she had in person, still composed but without the particular texture that the in-person version carried, the layering of someone managing multiple things at once. On the phone she sounded like one thing. He wasn't sure what the one thing was yet. "How did the appointment go?" He told her. Not all of it. Not the financial arithmetic. Not the way he'd felt in the waiting room. But the actual information. Reeves's assessment. The procedure timeline. The medication change. Sophie's current state, which was across the table eating a grilled cheese with the appetite of someone whose body had decided that the crisis portion of the day was done and the eating portion could now begin. Victoria listened without interrupting, which was not nothing. A lot of people interrupted. He's the right doctor, she said when he finished. Reeves. He has a reputation that's hard to overstate. I know. That's why we came. What are you going to do about the procedure costs? He was quiet for a moment. Figure it out, he said, which was the honest answer and also the complete answer, in the sense that it contained no details because the details had not yet been determined. I'd like to talk to you about that, she said. Not on the phone. Can you meet me? Where are you? The Fairmont Olympic. A pause. I know that's a certain kind of hotel. Yeah. He looked out the diner window at the street, the mist still hanging in the air the way Seattle air seemed to do regardless of technical weather conditions. I can come by around 4. Sophie needs to rest first. 4 is fine. Another pause, and this one had something in it that was not her usual register. Mason? Yeah. I want to be clear that this isn't... She stopped, started again. I help people through my company, through formal channels. I don't typically do things like this directly, because direct is complicated, and complicated gets messy, and I've spent a lot of years trying to keep things clean. He waited. I just want you to know that what I want to talk to you about isn't coming from guilt, she said. It's coming from something else. I'm not entirely sure what to call it yet. Okay, he said. 4 o'clock. He hung up and looked at Sophie, who had demolished the grilled cheese and was now working on the soup, and looking at him over the rim of the bowl with the alert eyes of someone who has heard a phone conversation and has opinions about it. Was that her? Sophie asked. Yeah. What did she want? To talk. Sophie considered this. About what? I don't entirely know yet, he said. Sophie returned to her soup. You should go, she said. She seems like she doesn't talk to many people, like really talks. He thought about what Victoria had said on the phone, the specific, careful way she'd started and restarted the sentence about what was and wasn't driving her call, the effort it had taken her to say it not quite right, rather than not say it at all. Yeah, he said. I think you might be right. The hotel lobby was everything the $64 motel room was not, which Mason registered without particular feeling one way or the other because he had grown up without money and had lost the habit of being impressed or embarrassed by its presence. He found a chair near the entrance of the lobby bar that had a clear sight line to the door and waited with his hands around a water glass and Sophie's purple notebook on the table in front of him, which she had loaned him for the meeting because she said he should write things down. Victoria arrived at 4:03. She had changed since the airport. Different jacket, dark gray, better pressed. Her hair was down now, which changed the geometry of her face in ways he hadn't seen before. She still had the scarf at her wrist, the burgundy one, tied differently than it had been, but still there. She sat across from him without preamble. You brought a notebook, she said. My daughter's, he said. She insisted. Something moved briefly across Victoria's face. She's not with you? She's at the hotel, asleep. She needed it. Victoria nodded. She had ordered coffee. The waiter appeared with it before she'd said anything to anyone visible, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at him with the directness he was learning was her default mode. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, not politely, she said. Okay. What did the procedure cost estimate come out to? Reeves's office gives preliminary estimates on the day. What was the number? He had known this question was coming, and he had decided on the drive over to answer it honestly, as she'd asked, which meant saying the number without the defensive architecture he usually built around it. 42,000, he said. With the insurance I have covering roughly half. The rest is on me. She didn't react to the number the way people who didn't deal with large numbers reacted to them. No widened eyes, no quiet intake of breath. She nodded, the nod of a person filing information. I have a foundation, she said. Technically, the foundation doesn't exist yet. It's in formation. The paperwork is in process. I've been planning it for about 2 years. She turned the coffee cup slowly. It exists because I grew up watching my mother drive 4 hours to a specialist appointment and then put the copay on a credit card that took 3 years to pay off. And because when I had the money to do something about that, I kept finding reasons to do it later. She looked at him. Gerald and everything he was doing took up most of my attention for the last 8 months. But the papers are filed. The structure is there. It just hasn't done anything yet. Okay, Mason said. I want Sophie to be the first, she said. The first family the foundation helps. I want to cover the remaining cost of her procedure. He looked at her, said nothing. Before you answer, she said, I want to head off the thing you're about to say, which is some version of we don't need charity. Because I've done enough financial modeling to know that a $21,000 gap on a procedure that has to happen in the next 6 months is not something you bridge on a single dad's income without consequences that affect your daughter in other ways. She wasn't unkind when she said it. She was just precise, the way a surgeon is precise, the way people who have spent time understanding systems are precise. It's not charity. It's a foundation with a mission that your daughter fits exactly. She's sick, her treatment is financeable, and her father spent an hour on a plane making sure a stranger could sleep. She paused. The last part isn't relevant to the foundation criteria. I'm just noting it. Mason sat with his hands on the table and the purple notebook in front of him and thought about what it felt like to be offered something you needed in a way that didn't make you feel reduced by the needing. It was unfamiliar. You don't know us, he said finally. I know enough, she said. I've been reading people for 10 years because I had to. It's not a perfect skill, Gerald made that clear, but I'm not wrong about this. If I say yes, he said, Sophie's going to want to do something in return. I should warn you about that up front. She's not good at receiving things without figuring out how to contribute. The corner of Victoria's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like the shape a smile makes before the person is sure it's appropriate. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He looked at the purple notebook. He thought about 11 months of arithmetic. He thought about the grinding sound the refrigerator had been making, and the truck registration, and the way Sophie had said, I'm glad we came in the hospital corridor with her face pressed to his jacket. He thought about a woman on a plane who had fallen asleep on his shoulder because she was running on empty, and the fact that he hadn't moved, and how that small and entirely unremarkable decision had somehow become the pivot point around which everything else was turning. Okay, he said. Victoria exhaled. It was a small sound, but it carried weight, the sound of someone who had been holding something and has just set it down. Okay, she said. They sat in the lobby of the Fairmont Olympic with coffee and water and a purple notebook, and they began to talk about what came next, not the entire future. Neither of them was in a position to plan the entire future with clarity, and both of them knew it, just the next things. The procedure timeline, the foundation paperwork, the practical steps that lived between where they were and where they needed to get. Outside the tall windows of the hotel, the Seattle mist was shifting toward genuine evening, the light going amber and low the way Pacific Northwest light does when the sun is somewhere behind the clouds doing its best. The street below had come alive with end-of-day foot traffic, umbrellas and coffee cups, and people moving with the specific purposeful randomness of a city in motion. Mason thought, not for the first time, that he had not planned for any of this. The flight, the seat, the woman who had needed to sleep and the scarf that had slipped, and the 8-year-old who had watched everything with her clear, undeceived eyes. He hadn't planned it. It had just happened, the way the things that matter usually do. Without announcement, in the middle of something else entirely, wearing the clothes of an ordinary moment. He opened the purple notebook to the first page. Sophie had drawn something on it before she'd given it to him. A small figure he recognized as Pepper, and beside it, in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, write the important things down. He picked up the pen the waiter had brought with the bill and would not be needing for a bill. And he wrote the date at the top of the page, and beneath it he wrote Reeves's direct number, and beneath that the name of Catherine Marsh, and beneath that a number that was large but was no longer the entire weight of everything. Across the table, Victoria Hale wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and did not look like a CEO or a crisis or a woman who had been betrayed by someone she trusted. She looked like a person who had arrived somewhere she hadn't known she was traveling toward. The mist pressed against the glass outside. The city moved on below them. And in a hotel 2 miles away, Sophie Carter slept with Pepper tucked under her arm and the ocean book on the pillow beside her, her heart doing the work it had always done. Imperfect, compensating, stubborn, and entirely her own. The flight back was quieter than the one out. Sophie slept for most of it, Genuinely slept, the deep and boneless sleep of a child whose body has been through a full medical workup and 2 days of irregular hours and more emotional weather than most adults handle in a month. She had the window seat again. Pepper was wedged between her cheek and the seat back. The ocean book was in her lap, closed this time, because she'd fallen asleep before she'd opened it. Mason sat beside her and watched the cloud cover below them and thought about money. Not the catastrophic version of thinking about money, which was what he'd been doing for the past 11 months. That version had a specific texture, a low-grade static that lived behind every other thought. The constant background calculation of what could be cut and what couldn't, and what happened if the thing that couldn't be cut had to be cut anyway. That version had been with him so long he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that's always present. This version was different. This version had a shape, a procedure with a timeline, a foundation with a name that didn't exist yet but would, a number that was still significant but was no longer the full weight of everything stacked against him. It was still a problem. It was just a problem with edges now, which made it a different kind of problem entirely. He thought about the conversation in the hotel lobby. Victoria's hands around the coffee cup. The specific way she'd said it's not charity, with the precision of someone who had understood in advance exactly which word he would push back on. He thought about how she'd looked when he'd said okay. He hadn't expected that look. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Relief, maybe? Or the professional satisfaction of a transaction completed. What he'd seen instead was something quieter and more complicated. The expression of someone who had done something they'd been planning for a long time, and had found that doing it felt different than the planning had suggested it would. Not disappointing, just different. More real somehow, and slightly more fragile because of it. He'd said at the end of the meeting that Sophie was going to want to contribute something. He'd said it as a warning. He hadn't said the other part, which was that he understood the impulse exactly because it was his too. Not pride in the destructive sense, not the refusal of help when help was genuinely needed, but the need to be useful in return. To not just receive, to be part of something rather than the recipient of it. He hadn't said that because it wasn't the right moment, but it was true. Outside the oval window, the clouds stretched in every direction, and the sun was doing something extraordinary with the light above them. All that gold hitting all that white, the kind of view you only get from an airplane and that people who fly a lot stop seeing. Mason wasn't someone who flew a lot. He looked at it. Sophie stirred beside him, not waking, just shifting the way people shift in deep sleep, and he reached over and settled the ocean book more securely in her lap so it wouldn't slide to the floor. His phone had a text from Victoria. He'd given her his number at the end of the meeting, and she'd texted at some point during the drive back to the budget motel to collect Sophie, a text he hadn't read until now. It said, "Catherine will be in touch with the paperwork this week. The foundation's legal name is going to be the Hale Meridian Family Fund. I'll tell you why when we talk again, if you want to know." He read it twice. Then he typed back, "I want to know. Safe flight tomorrow." He put the phone in his pocket. He didn't know if there would be a when we talk again. He knew she'd said it. He knew that she was the kind of person who said things she meant, or at least that she was trying to become that kind of person again, in the aftermath of having trusted someone who had spent months systematically proving that trust wrong. He knew that those two things, meaning what you say and being able to deliver it across the distance between two people who live different lives in different cities and came together by the specific accident of adjacent airplane seats, were not the same thing. But the text was real. The number in the purple notebook was real. Sophie's procedure was real, or would be in the next several months, and that was the realest thing of all. He leaned his head back, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, actually slept on an airplane. 3 weeks later, Catherine Marsh called on a Tuesday afternoon while Mason was on his lunch break from the loading dock where he worked 3 days a week, sitting in his truck in the parking lot with a sandwich he'd made that morning and a thermos of coffee that had gone from hot to room temperature somewhere around 11. "The foundation paperwork cleared," Catherine said. "Victoria wanted you to know directly." "Okay," Mason said. "What does that mean for Sophie's timeline?" "It means the funds are accessible. Dr. Reeves's office has already been in contact with the foundation's administrator. Victoria moved quickly on that, which is..." A brief pause that contained something. Not always how foundations operate in the first month of existence, but she was specific about the priority. A shuffle of papers. The procedure is scheduled for the 14th of next month. Reeves's team will send you the pre-procedure instructions this week. Mason set down his sandwich. He'd known it was coming. He had known since Seattle that it was coming, had been holding the knowledge carefully the way you hold something that might still break if handled wrong. But hearing it stated flatly, the 14th of next month, Reeves's team, pre-procedure instructions, made it real in a new way. The difference between knowing something will happen and knowing when. Thank you, he said. Not to Catherine specifically, or not only to Catherine, to the general fact of the thing. There's one more item, Catherine said. Victoria would like to speak with you. In person, if that's possible. She's going to be in your area. She named the city, which was a mid-sized city in the upper Midwest, which was where Mason and Sophie lived. In about 10 days, she has a meeting at a regional hospital network. She wanted to know if you'd be open to dinner. Mason looked out through the truck's windshield at the loading dock. 2 of his co-workers were coming out for their own break, pulling on jackets against the late autumn cold. She's coming here, he said. Her meeting is here, Catherine said. The dinner would be separate. She said to tell you it's not business, in case you were wondering. I was wondering, he said. She anticipated that. He thought about Sophie, who had asked 3 times in the week since Seattle whether Victoria had called. Not in the way of someone expecting something specific, just in the way of someone who had decided a person mattered and was tracking whether the mattering was mutual. He'd told her each time that they'd been in touch, which was true, and Sophie had nodded with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd already concluded. Okay, he said. Dinner. He heard something in Catherine's voice when she said good, something that was not the voice of an attorney delivering a client's message, but of a person who is pleased that 2 other people are going to see each other, which Catherine seemed to recognize she'd revealed and quickly covered with the professional tone she snapped back into for the remaining details. He finished his sandwich in the truck and thought about how strange it was that the things you didn't plan for were so often the ones that turned out to matter. Gerald Whitmore had been quiet for 3 weeks, which was not the same thing as having gone away. Victoria knew this the way she knew most things about Gerald, not from direct evidence, but from the shape of the absence, the specific quality of a silence that is chosen rather than natural. Gerald did not go quiet because situations resolved themselves. He went quiet because he was reconfiguring. The board meeting was in 6 days. She was sitting in her office on the 31st floor of the building that housed Hale Meridian's headquarters, looking at a spreadsheet that Catherine had sent over the previous afternoon, a voting analysis, color-coded, that showed the current distribution of board allegiances with a precision that was either reassuring or terrifying depending on the column you were reading. The reassuring column showed that she had 11 of the 17 votes she needed secured. The terrifying column showed that 4 remained genuinely uncertain, and that Gerald had spent the past 3 weeks making calls to each of them, which Catherine's contact at the board's legal office had confirmed without using the word confirmed. She turned away from the spreadsheet and looked out the window instead. The city from 31 floors up had the quality it always had. Orderly from a distance, the individual chaos of it smoothed out by altitude into something that looked like a plan. She thought about what she had on her side. The drive, first. Catherine had retained a forensic digital analyst who had spent 2 weeks creating a complete documented record of what the drive contained, altered financial records, falsified board communications, a thread of email exchanges that established both Gerald's intent and the timeline of his actions. The original was in a secure physical facility. 3 certified copies existed in separate locations. Gerald could not claim the evidence didn't exist, and he could not claim it was fabricated, because the metadata trail was longer than he'd had time to alter. She had the airport footage, which she had quietly retained a copy of through channels that were entirely legal and which Catherine had told her to keep in reserve. Gerald had withdrawn the complaint against Mason, but withdrawing a complaint didn't erase the footage. It only meant the footage was no longer part of an active airport security file. It was still on the servers. It could still be retrieved if the need arose. And she had the internal audit she'd commissioned 2 months before Seattle, when she'd first understood what she was dealing with. The audit had been conducted by a firm Gerald had no relationship with, by people who had no way to know what they were looking for until they found it. What they had found was a pattern, not a single transaction, not an isolated decision, but a pattern of small redirections, each individually defensible, collectively damning. She had enough. Catherine had told her she had enough 3 times in the past week, in the specifically emphatic way that Catherine told people things she wanted them to actually believe rather than intellectually accept. Victoria accepted it intellectually. She was working on the believing part. The difficulty was not the evidence. The difficulty was the board. 11 secured votes was not 17. The 4 uncertain votes belonged to people she had known for years, people who had sat in rooms with her and nodded and eaten the dinners and accepted the quarterly reports and said things to her face that she had at the time interpreted as support. She was no longer sure how to interpret them. That uncertainty, more than anything Gerald had done, had changed something in her that she was not sure how to change back. She trusted fewer people than she had a year ago. She trusted them differently. More carefully, with more of the calculation visible in the trusting, which was not the same as not trusting. She understood that. She'd worked through it with a therapist she'd started seeing in September, and who had a useful and unpretty way of naming things. But it meant that trust had become a deliberate act instead of an instinct, which was, she thought, not entirely a loss. She thought about Mason Carter on a plane, deciding not to move. It was a strange thing to return to. She returned to it anyway, the way you return to a memory that is quietly doing something to your thinking without declaring itself. A man who had no reason to protect a stranger's rest and every practical reason to move, who had chosen to stay still for an hour in a seat that didn't recline because someone needed the sleep. It was not a complicated decision. It was not a dramatic one. It hadn't even been visible to anyone except Sophie, and Sophie had only seen it because she'd woken during the turbulence. Nobody had known. Mason had known, and had done it anyway. She had spent 10 years learning to find the calculation behind every gesture, and she was very good at it, and it served her in most contexts, and she could not find the calculation in that one. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that resolved, when she opened it, to a name she'd been expecting, and a message she hadn't quite. It was from David Farrell, one of the 4 uncertain board votes. It said, "I'd like to talk before the meeting, not in the office." Lunch? She looked at the text for a moment. David Farrell had been on the board for 4 years. He had voted with her consistently in that time, including on 3 decisions that had been genuinely contested. He had also, according to Catherine's information, taken a call from Gerald 17 days ago that had lasted 38 minutes. She wrote back, "Tomorrow, 1 o'clock. The place on Meridian, not the one near the office." He replied in 4 minutes, "I'll be there." She put the phone face down on the desk and went back to the spreadsheet. 11 votes, possibly 12. She needed 17. What? The lunch with David Farrell was at a restaurant that was not near the office, because not near the office meant not observable by anyone who reported to anyone who talked to Gerald, which was a filtering criterion she now applied automatically to the selection of venues for sensitive conversations, a habit she'd developed in the past 6 months that she did not entirely like having developed, but that was unquestionably useful. David was already there when she arrived. He was 61, a compact man with reading glasses he kept forgetting to take off when they weren't serving their purpose, and he had the quality she'd always associated with him of someone who was more perceptive than he appeared, and had made peace with being underestimated. He stood when she came in. She sat. They ordered without ceremony. He had the soup, she had nothing yet, coffee first. "You know Gerald called me," he said. He said it without preamble, which was one of the things she'd always found useful about him. "I know," she said. "Then you know what he told me." "I know what he told me he was going to tell the uncertain votes," she said, "which is that I've been destabilizing the company's strategic direction, that the Q3 numbers are worse than what I reported to the board, and that the evidence I claim to have against him is fabricated or exaggerated." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "How close is that?" David looked at her steadily. "Very." "And do you believe him?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty. She'd seen that. She knew what it looked like. But the quiet of a man choosing his words because the words mattered. and he respected both of them enough to get them right. "I believe he's frightened," David said. Frightened men say things in a particular register. They're very fluent, very specific. They have answers to questions you haven't asked yet. He took off his reading glasses, which had been sitting on his head doing nothing, and folded them on the table. "I've been in business for 35 years, Victoria. I know what frightened looks like." "And me?" she asked. "What do I look like?" "You look like someone who's been at war for 8 months and is almost done," he said. She absorbed that. "I need 17 votes." "I know." "I have 11. He picked up his glasses again, a fidgeting gesture, turned them in his hand. "Who else is uncertain?" "Patricia Nguyen, Robert Slade, and James Whitfield." "James is Gerald's," David said flatly. "Has been since the start. If you get James, something's gone wrong you don't know about yet." She nodded. She'd suspected this. Having it confirmed was useful. "Patricia I can talk to," David said. We have a relationship that Gerald doesn't know the depth of. He wouldn't have targeted her the way he did if he'd understood the relationship." "That leaves Slade." David turned his glasses over again. "Robert Slade is scared of Gerald for reasons that have nothing to do with the company," he said carefully. "There's a history there. I don't know all of it, but I know that Robert's no is not a no about you. It's a no about what happens to him if he votes against Gerald, and Gerald survives." He met her eyes. "You need to make it safe for him." "How do I make it safe for someone who's scared of a man I'm trying to remove?" "You show him what you have," David said. "Not in summary, the full thing. You sit across from him with the evidence in front of both of you, and you let him read it. Because Robert Slade is a coward about some things, but he's not stupid about any of them. And when he sees what Gerald actually built, he'll understand that the safer position is the one that puts Gerald out of power permanently." Victoria thought about this. "If I show him the full evidence and he shares what he's seen with Gerald—" "He won't," David said. "I'd stake considerable on that." She looked at him. "You're asking me to trust your read on a man you've just told me is scared." "Yes," David said. "I am." He held her look. "Is that a problem?" She thought about 11 months of being careful. About Gerald, who she had trusted completely and had been completely wrong about. About David, who was sitting across from her in a restaurant off the main avenue asking her to trust his read on a scared man, and who had come to this lunch without Gerald asking him to, and who had said, "I know what frightened looks like," in the voice of someone who meant the specific thing those words meant. She thought about Mason Carter not moving for an hour. Not every decision came with evidence sufficient to remove all risk. Sometimes you read what was in front of you, not what you could verify, and you moved. "No," she said. "It's not a problem." David put his glasses on properly for the first time since she'd arrived, picked up his spoon, and addressed his soup. "I'll call Patricia today," he said. "You should call Slade directly. Don't use Catherine. It needs to come from you, not through a lawyer. He needs to see that you're willing to be exposed in order to expose this." "All right." "And Victoria." He looked up from the soup. "I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner. When Gerald called, I should have called you the same day, and I didn't because—" He stopped. "I don't have a good reason. I have a reason, but it's not good." She looked at him. "I was calculating," he said, "which is what you do when you're not sure, and I was not sure. And I'm sorry." She had not expected that. She had expected information, strategy, votes, not apology. She didn't know quite what to do with it, which she recognized was part of the problem Catherine's therapist had been pointing at for 2 months. "Okay," she said, which was not as gracious as it could have been and was more honest than most things. He seemed to understand the difference and accept it. She called Robert Slade that evening from her apartment, not the office. He answered on the 4th ring with the careful voice of someone who has been expecting a call from a direction they couldn't quite locate. She didn't open with pleasantries. She said, "I know Gerald has spoken to you. I know what he said. And I know there's a history between you two that makes this complicated for you personally. I'm not going to pretend I know the details because I don't. But I want to show you what I have, Robert. All of it. Not a summary. The complete record. In person. Before the board meeting. And I want you to make your decision based on what's actually there, not on what Gerald has told you is there." Silence. "Victoria," he said. and his voice had the texture of a man navigating something privately difficult. "If I come to you and this goes wrong, it won't go wrong," she said. "The evidence is solid. Catherine has had 3 independent analysts verify it. But more than that, Gerald is running out of moves. He tried to steal the physical drive in a Seattle airport and got caught on camera. He filed a false accusation against an innocent man and had to withdraw it. He's been working from fear for weeks. Fear makes people sloppy, and sloppy people leave records, and Gerald has left more than he knows." Another silence, shorter this time. "You're certain," he said. "Yes." The words sat in the phone line between them. "Thursday," Slade said. "6 p.m. I'd rather not come to your office." "Name somewhere." He named a hotel bar in the financial district, neutral territory, the kind of place that was busy enough to be anonymous. She said yes, without hesitation. When she hung up, she sat in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and thought about David Farrell saying, "You need to make it safe for him," and about her own decision to trust that read, and about how differently trust felt when it was a choice you could examine rather than an instinct you acted on before you'd noticed it. It felt more fragile this way. She wasn't sure yet if fragile was better or worse. She suspected it was just different, more visible, which meant more manageable, which was something. Her phone showed a notification. Mason had replied to the text she'd sent 3 days ago. A brief exchange about Sophie's pre-procedure paperwork, which had taken a slight administrative detour that required Mason to submit an additional form through Reeves's office. He'd handled it, as he seemed to handle everything, without catastrophizing or requiring management. His reply now said, "Form submitted." "Sophie says to tell you that she's decided to learn about the heart for real so she can understand what Reeves is doing. She's already been to the library." Victoria read it twice. She typed back, "What did she find?" His reply came 4 minutes later. "A book about cardiac anatomy for kids that she says is more complicated than it looks." She drew a diagram. "It's anatomically questionable, but the effort was serious." Victoria looked at this for a moment. Then she typed, "Can I see it?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then a photo came through, a scan of a page from Sophie's purple notebook, a drawing that was indeed anatomically questionable. The chambers of the heart rendered in 8-year-old approximation with small labels in careful handwriting. Left ventricle, right ventricle. The valve with a small arrow pointing to it labeled this one, the important one. Victoria sat with her phone in her kitchen and looked at this drawing for considerably longer than the drawing technically required. Then she typed, "She's right. That one is the important one." His reply, when it came, was only, "Yeah." She put the phone face down on the counter and went to make tea, because it was late and she had an early call with Catherine in the morning and a board meeting in 6 days, and a lunch with David Farrell's information to turn into a strategy and a meeting with Robert Slade on Thursday that was either going to get her to 15 votes or confirm what she already suspected about the edges of trust and what they could and couldn't bear. But the drawing stayed in her head. The small arrow, the careful handwriting. This one, the important one. She thought about being 8 years old, which was a long time ago, and about her mother driving 4 hours to a specialist and the copay on the credit card and the 3 years to pay it off. She thought about building something that could mean that some other kid's father didn't carry that specific arithmetic alone for 11 months. She thought it was possible to care about that and also about the board meeting simultaneously, without one canceling the other out. She had not always thought that. It was a change in something. She wasn't done making it, but she was further along than she'd been in Seattle. The tea kettle began to make its preliminary noises. She stood in her kitchen at 10:45 on a Tuesday night and thought, 6 more days. And then whatever comes after 6 days. And then, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to think about what after might actually look like, instead of only about the obstacle between here and there. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was a real one. That was enough for tonight. The board meeting was on a Thursday, which felt arbitrary until it didn't. Victoria had learned in 10 years of running a company that the days on which things happened rarely felt like the right days beforehand. The significant moments of her professional life had almost uniformly arrived on ordinary weekday mornings when she had other things scheduled and the coffee was average and there was nothing in the air to suggest that the next several hours were going to determine the shape of the years that followed. Today was like that. Gray sky outside the 31st floor windows. Her second coffee going cold on the desk. Catherine in the chair across from her, going through the final voting analysis with the focused calm of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows and has made peace with the residual uncertainty. Patricia Nguyen confirmed last night, Catherine said. David reached her Tuesday, and she called me directly on Wednesday morning. She's a yes. That's 13, Victoria said. 14, Catherine said. Robert Slade. Victoria looked up. He called me at 7 this morning, Catherine said. He said, she checked her phone. Tell her I read everything and I've made my decision. That's the full message. He wouldn't say more over the phone. Victoria sat with that for a moment. Robert Slade, who had been scared for reasons she didn't fully know and didn't need to fully know, who had come to the hotel bar on Thursday evening and sat across from her while she laid out the complete record, every document, every altered figure, every email thread, with his hands flat on the table and his face doing the specific work of a man processing something he'd suspected but had not yet been forced to see in its entirety. He had not said much that evening. He had read carefully. He had asked 2 questions, both technical, both about dates and sequences, rather than about the larger meaning, because the larger meaning was clear enough that neither of them needed to name it. When he'd left, he'd said, I'll let you know. She had not known until 7 this morning what let you know would turn out to mean. 14, she said. You need 17, Catherine said. James Whitfield is Gerald's, as David told you. That leaves 2 more from the remaining pool. I know who the 2 are, Victoria said. Margaret Chen and Paul Adler, Catherine confirmed. Neither of them has taken Gerald's calls, according to my information, which doesn't tell you how they'll vote, but it tells you they haven't committed to him. Victoria had spoken to both of them herself separately in the days before the meeting. Not to lobby. She had made a deliberate decision not to lobby beyond the evidence, because lobbying felt like Gerald's method, and she was trying to do this differently. She had called them to tell them what she had and to answer questions. Margaret Chen had asked 11 questions, all of them precise, none of them friendly or unfriendly, the questions of a woman doing her own analysis rather than accepting someone else's. Paul Adler had listened mostly in silence and at the end had said, I'll be at the meeting, which was not the same as yes, but it was not no. We go in with what we have, Victoria said. Catherine looked at her. You're calm. I'm tired of being afraid, Victoria said. It's not the same thing, but it'll do. Catherine closed her folder. It'll do, she agreed. Get. The boardroom was on the 32nd floor, one above Victoria's office, with windows that faced the same direction, but from slightly higher up, which meant the city looked marginally more orderly from up there, a difference so small it was almost philosophical. The table was long enough for all 17 board members, plus Catherine, who attended as legal counsel, and the 2 additional staff members who managed the meeting documentation. Gerald Whitmore arrived 4 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, which was his habit. Early enough to be positioned, late enough not to appear eager. He was wearing a dark suit that Victoria recognized as his board meeting suit, the one he'd worn to every significant vote in the 4 years he'd been a board member and executive. He looked, as he always looked in this room, like someone who belonged here and knew it. He looked at Victoria when he came in. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say in the conventional sense, and both of them knew it. He sat at his customary seat, 3 chairs down on the left side of the table. Victoria sat at the head. Catherine sat to her right. The room filled in around them with the specific low-register tension of people who are aware that something significant is about to happen and are managing their awareness of this with varying degrees of success. James Whitfield sat near Gerald, as David had predicted. Margaret Chen sat in the middle of the table where she always sat, her notepad already open, her pen already in her hand. Paul Adler came in last, nodded to no one in particular, and sat down. The meeting was called to order at 9 a.m. The first 40 minutes were procedural, quarterly reports, standing agenda items, the administrative infrastructure that board meetings required regardless of what else was happening. Victoria moved through it with the efficiency of someone who has run enough of these to do the procedural portion on a separate track, while the majority of her attention remained on the room. She watched Gerald in her peripheral vision. He was attentive, engaged, making notes, performing normalcy with the skill of long practice. Then she said, "There's a matter I need to bring before the board that isn't on the standard agenda." The room changed, not dramatically. No one moved, no one made a sound that was out of place, but the quality of attention shifted, the way a room's attention shifts when the thing everyone has been aware of beneath the surface is finally named. "I'm going to present evidence," Victoria said, "of a coordinated effort to misrepresent Hale Meridian's financial position to the board and to certain external parties, and to use those misrepresentations to engineer a change in the company's executive structure." She kept her voice level, the way she'd practiced. Not flat, not performed, just steady. "The evidence has been verified by 3 independent forensic accounting firms. Catherine Marsh will speak to the verification process. After she does, I'll ask each of you to review the documentation directly." She did not look at Gerald when she said this. She heard him, though. The specific quality of his stillness, which was different from the stillness of the other people in the room. Everyone else's stillness was attentive. His was calculated. Catherine spoke for 12 minutes, walking through the verification methodology with the precise, unadorned clarity that was her professional signature. She named the firms. She described the process. She explained what had been found and how the finding had been confirmed. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. Then the documentation was distributed. Printed copies, bound, one for each board member. Victoria had decided against a digital presentation for reasons that were partly practical and partly instinctive. Something about putting paper in people's hands felt different, more real, harder to dismiss as something that could be closed with a click. The room read. It took 22 minutes. Some people read faster than others. Margaret Chen took the full time and made notes in the margins. Paul Adler read it straight through without stopping. David Farrell read it with his glasses on, which meant he was serious about it. James Whitfield read it with the expression of someone who already knew what it said and was deciding how to perform surprise. Gerald did not read it. He sat with the bound copy in front of him and his hands folded on the table and his face composed into an expression that was professionally neutral and personally furious in the specific way of someone who is furious at having been outmaneuvered rather than at having been caught, which told you something important about his understanding of what had happened. When the room had finished, Victoria said, "I'll take questions." What followed was 40 minutes of the most careful, intelligent, and occasionally brutal questioning she had experienced in a boardroom, which was saying something given the previous decade. Margaret Chen led it. Her 11 preparatory questions had apparently been the warm-up, because what she asked now was more surgical and more specific, targeting the 3 points in the documentation where the causal chain required the most careful explanation. Victoria answered each one. Catherine supplemented twice, both times with documentary references that required going back to specific pages. David Farrell asked one question about the timeline that filled in a gap Margaret had identified. Paul Adler asked nothing. James Whitfield at minute 37 said, "This is a selective presentation of information taken out of context." The room looked at him. "The documentation speaks for itself," Catherine said, in the tone that Catherine used when she was being professionally courteous and personally contemptuous simultaneously. "If there is a specific factual error in the record, you can identify it." Whitfield did not identify a specific factual error. Gerald spoke for the first time at minute 41. "Victoria." His voice was what it always was, controlled, authoritative, pitched for a room this size. "You and I have worked together for 4 years. Whatever you believe you've found—" "Gerald," Victoria said. "Don't." It was the same word she'd said in the airport corridor in Seattle, the same register. He heard the echo of it. She could see from his face that he heard it, and she watched him make the decision to try anyway. "You're making an accusation that will damage this company." "The documentation is the accusation," Victoria said. "I didn't write it. You did. Every record in that binder was created by you or at your direction. What I did was find it and verify it and bring it here." She let a beat pass. "That's what the CEO is supposed to do." The room was very quiet. Then Margaret Chen said without inflection, "I'd like to move to a vote, sir." The vote was 16-1. James Whitfield cast the dissenting vote. Every other board member voted to accept the findings, to remove Gerald Whitmore from his position as executive board member and to refer the matter to the company's legal team for determination of further action. Paul Adler, who had said nothing in 40 minutes of questioning, raised his hand for yes without hesitation when the vote was called, and Victoria understood then that his silence had not been uncertainty. It had been the silence of a man who had already decided and saw no reason to perform deliberation he wasn't actually doing. Gerald left the boardroom without speaking to anyone. His face, in the moment before he walked out, had the expression of a man who has spent years building something in a direction he chose, and has arrived at the destination that direction was always going to produce, and who is only now, at the end of the construction, understanding what he built. Victoria watched him go. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated. The specific emotional texture of a thing that is over, which is not the same as the emotional texture of a thing that ended well. It had ended correctly. That was what she had. It would have to be enough, and in time it probably would be. But right now, sitting in the boardroom at the head of the long table with the bound copies of evidence that had taken 8 months to compile and verify distributed around the room, it felt like the conclusion of something that should never have had to happen, rather than the victory of something that had. Margaret Chen, gathering her things on the way out, stopped beside Victoria's chair. "You did that well," she said. Not warmly, but honestly, which was Margaret's register and which Victoria had learned to read correctly. "Thank you for your questions," Victoria said. "The hard ones matter." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "they do." And she left. David Farrell was the last to go. He paused at the door. "Lunch next week?" he said. "No agenda." "Yes," Victoria said. "No agenda." Catherine waited until the room was empty, then sat back down next to Victoria and poured water from the carafe into 2 glasses and slid one across to her. They sat in the empty boardroom in the specific quiet of a concluded thing. 16-1, Catherine said. "Yeah. You thought you had 14. "Paul Adler surprised me," Victoria said. "People do," Catherine said. "Occasionally in the right direction." Victoria drank the water. Outside the windows, the city continued its business, indifferent as cities are to the specific dramas occurring in the buildings that constitute them. Somewhere in the street below, people were going to lunch and hailing cabs and checking their phones, and none of it was touched by what had just happened in this room, and that was as it should be. "The foundation," Victoria said. Catherine looked at her. "What about it?" "I want to move faster. The formation process. Can we accelerate the public launch? I've been treating it like it needs to be perfect before it's visible, and it doesn't. It needs to be real before it's perfect." Catherine considered this. "We can have a soft launch in 6 weeks. Website, initial grant structure, application portal. The full public announcement event would take longer to organize properly." 6 weeks for the soft launch, Victoria said, "and I want Mason Carter involved in the structure. Not symbolically, actually involved. He understands what these families are dealing with from the inside. I don't, not anymore. I have the memory of it, and I have the data, but he has the current knowledge." "Have you asked him?" "Not yet." "Ask him," Catherine said. Victoria looked at the window. "I'm going to," she said. "When I see him next week." Catherine made a note and did not say anything about the particular way Victoria had said next week, which was one of the things Victoria valued about Catherine. She noticed things and chose deliberately what to do with having noticed them. Sophie's procedure was on the 14th. The date had been in Mason's calendar for 3 weeks, marked not with any notation but simply present, a square on the month with the number 14 in it that he found himself looking at every morning when he checked the week, the way you look at something that you cannot move toward faster than time allows. He drove Sophie to the hospital at 5:30 in the morning. She was quiet in the car, not frightened. Quiet, but thinking quiet, which was a distinction Mason had learned to make years ago. She had her purple notebook in her lap, and she was drawing something in the dark of the car by feel, which was a thing she did sometimes when she was working something out internally and needed her hands occupied. "You okay?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. "About?" She considered whether to say, About how the heart doesn't know it's being fixed, she said. It just keeps doing what it does while people do things to it. That's kind of brave. Mason drove for a moment without answering. The road was mostly empty at that hour, the suburban streets dark and still, the occasional traffic light cycling through its colors for nobody. Or just persistent, he said. Maybe that's the same thing, Sophie said. He didn't have a response to that. He thought she might be right. The hospital at 5:30 in the morning had the hushed quality of an institution operating on its overnight logic, the quieter rhythms of the hours before the full daytime population arrived. A nurse named Dana met them at the pre-procedure check-in with the warm efficiency of someone who does this regularly and has not stopped understanding that for the people coming through the door, it is not regular. She walked Sophie through the prep without talking down to her, which Sophie noticed and responded to with the cooperative focus she reserved for people who treated her like someone whose participation mattered. Mason stayed with Sophie through the prep and into the pre-procedure bay, sitting in the chair beside her bed, while the anesthesiologist came and explained, and while the surgical team introduced themselves one by one, until the moment when the nurse told him gently that he'd need to wait outside now, and Sophie looked at him with the clear eyes she'd had her whole life and said, "I know." "I know you know," he said. "You can wait," she said. "I'll be done before you run out of things to think about." He kissed her forehead. She let him, which she didn't always anymore, which told him she was less entirely fine than she was presenting. He held her hand for a moment, her small hand in his, the hand he'd been holding in airports and hospital waiting rooms and school hallways and parking lots for 8 years. And then he let go and walked out through the door that closed behind him. The waiting room was on the second floor, a room with chairs and a coffee station and a television on a mount showing a morning news program with the sound off and the captions running. Mason sat in a chair that faced away from the television and put his hands on his knees and waited. His phone showed a text that had come in while he was in the pre-procedure bay. Victoria. It said, "Thinking of you both today. Text me when she's out." He read it. He didn't text back immediately because there wasn't anything to say yet. He put the phone back in his pocket and sat with his hands on his knees and let the room be what it was. He thought about the year and a half before Seattle, the version of him that had been running on arithmetic and stubbornness and love and not much else. He had not been a person who asked for things easily. He had not been a person who accepted them easily either. He had understood this about himself without knowing what to do with it, the same way you understand a weather pattern that you can't change and can only navigate. Something had shifted in the navigation. He wasn't sure exactly when, but he suspected the precise moment was somewhere in the dark of a night flight, in the space between deciding to move and deciding not to, in the unremarkable and unobserved choice to let a tired stranger sleep. He had not known what he was doing when he made that choice. He had not been thinking about consequences or returns. He had been thinking, insofar as he had been thinking anything deliberate, that she needed the rest, and he could provide it by simply not taking it away. That was the sum total of the calculation. It hadn't felt like generosity. It had felt like the obvious thing. The procedure took 3 hours and 14 minutes. Dr. Reeves came out to the waiting room himself, which was not standard protocol for procedures of this type, and which Mason understood was a deliberate choice rather than a default action. "It went well," Reeves said. He sat down in the chair beside Mason rather than standing, which was also a deliberate choice, the body language of someone who intends to give you the full information and wants you to be stable while receiving it. The valve repair was clean. The catheterization gave us better access than the imaging had suggested, which is the direction you want that particular surprise to go. Her heart rate and blood pressure were stable throughout. He paused, the pause of a man being precise. "She did well. She's going to be in recovery for a couple hours, and she'll need to stay overnight for observation, but the procedure itself went exactly as we'd hoped." Mason looked at the floor for a moment. He didn't cry. He had not been a crier, not in public, not in the presence of other people, not since the 18 months since Claire had built him into someone who could not afford the release because the release would be too large, and he had too many things to hold upright. But something moved in him that was adjacent to tears, a physical thing, a pressure behind the eyes and in the chest that he acknowledged without letting through. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out even. He was grateful for that. "She's going to want to see you in about an hour," Reeves said. "The nurses will come get you. He stood, then paused. Your daughter told the anesthesiologist that she'd looked up the procedure beforehand and wanted to understand what each stage felt like so she could track her own experience. He said it with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal in his career and is, occasionally, still surprised by something. She's an unusual kid, Mr. Carter. Yeah, Mason said. She is. Reeves left. Mason sat alone in the waiting room with the muted television and the cold coffee and the specific silence of a space where people wait for news, and he sent Victoria a text that said, "She's out." It went well. Her reply came in 40 seconds, which was fast enough to suggest she'd been holding the phone. It said, "I'm so glad. Tell her I said she was brave." He thought about what Sophie had said in the car. Maybe persistent and brave are the same thing. He typed back, "She said the heart doesn't know it's being fixed. It just keeps going. She thinks that's a kind of bravery." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "She's right, she usually is." 6 weeks later, the Hale Meridian Family Fund held its soft launch. It was not an event exactly. Victoria had resisted the instinct to make the soft launch into a performance, which was an instinct she'd had to argue against with the company's communications team, who had strong opinions about press opportunities. What happened instead was quieter. A website went live, an application portal opened, and a short statement was published explaining the fund's mission in language that was plain enough to be actually useful to the people it was meant to reach. Mason had written the section about what families actually needed to know, which was different from the section about what the fund was, and Victoria had changed almost nothing in his draft because it was correct in ways that her version had not been. He had written it at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening while Sophie did homework at the other end of the table and occasionally asked him how to spell things, and it had taken him 40 minutes and 2 attempts, and the second attempt was the one that went live. Sophie had read it when it was published and said, "You wrote that." "How do you know?" "Because it sounds like you're talking," she said. Not like a thing someone made up. He supposed that was the goal. The 3 months between Seattle and now had changed things in ways that were not dramatic and not linear. He still worked the loading dock 3 days a week. The refrigerator had been repaired eventually by a method involving a YouTube video and a replacement part that cost $37, which was a victory he'd celebrated privately with a level of satisfaction disproportionate to the stakes. Sophie was back in school and had informed him that Dr. Reeves had been right about the running. She had run the full lap in gym class for the first time and had not had to stop. And she had reported this to Mason with the specific, measured pride of someone who had worked for something and arrived at it. He and Victoria had talked on the phone 6 times in 3 months. Not about the foundation, not about Gerald or the board or any of the machinery that had surrounded their first meeting. They had talked about the things that people talk about when they are becoming something to each other that doesn't have a clean category yet. Sophie's progress, and Victoria's therapist, who she mentioned once with the careful casualness of someone not sure how the information will land, and which Mason had received without ceremony because there was no ceremony required. They had talked about his wife once, briefly, in the way you talk about someone who is gone when the person you're talking to has made enough space that the going doesn't have to be kept at a distance. He had not told Sophie about the calls, and Sophie had not asked directly, and he suspected she knew anyway because she was Sophie, and Sophie's information about the world around her tended to be more complete than she advertised. The dinner in his city, the one Catherine had brokered from a hotel lobby 3 months ago, had happened. It had been at a restaurant that was not expensive and not cheap, a place with good food and the ambient noise level that makes real conversation possible, and they had eaten and talked for 3 hours, and he had walked her back to her hotel, and they had stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the specific way of 2 people who are aware of a threshold and are being honest about not knowing yet which side of it they're on. She had said, "This was good." He had said, "Yeah." She had said, "I'm bad at this part, the normal part, the part that isn't a crisis." He had thought about that honestly. "I think you're better at it than you think," he said. "I think you've just spent a long time in situations that required the other version of you." She had looked at him on the sidewalk with the gray-green eyes that he'd been given 30 seconds to register on a night flight 4 months ago. "Is that an observation or an argument?" she asked. "Both, probably," he said. She had smiled then, a real one, not the partial version he'd seen in the airport corridor or the careful one from the lobby of the Fairmont. A full-face, unmanaged smile that was slightly crooked on one side and that she didn't seem to know was happening, which was what made it what it was. She had said goodnight and gone inside. He had stood on the sidewalk for another 30 seconds, not for any particular reason, and then walked back to his truck. The opening ceremony for the Foundation's public launch was 3 months after the soft launch, which put it in early spring, which was not intentional, but which turned out to be appropriate in the way that unintentional things sometimes are, the city coming back to itself after winter. The specific quality of March light that is tentative and genuinely warm in alternating minutes. The venue was a community hall attached to a children's hospital on the east side of the city, chosen because it was functional rather than impressive, because the people the Foundation was meant to serve were more likely to feel welcome in a community hall than in the kind of space that money usually chose for events about itself. Sophie had made this argument to Victoria over a video call 6 weeks before the event, and Victoria had made the choice accordingly, and the communications team had eventually accepted it. Sophie was 9 now. She had grown 2 inches since Seattle, which her pediatrician attributed to the fact that her heart was no longer spending energy it didn't have, and which Mason attributed to the same cause with more private feeling. She was wearing a green dress that she'd chosen herself, and her hair in the 2 imprecise braids that Mason continued to produce with the same determined approximation, and she had her purple notebook in her hands because she had decided she wanted to write things down. Victoria was at the front of the room when they arrived, talking to a woman Mason recognized from the Foundation's board, not Hale Meridian's board, the Foundation's board, which was a separate entity and which included 2 pediatric specialists, a social worker, a hospital administrator, and a parent of a child with a chronic condition, because Victoria had specifically wanted the people with actual knowledge of the problem to outnumber the people with the financial expertise. She saw them come in. Something in her face changed in the way it changed sometimes when she saw Sophie specifically. Not sentimentality, which was too soft a word, but something more durable. Recognition, maybe. Sophie went directly to her, which was Sophie's way. "Your hair is down," Sophie said. "It is," Victoria said. "You should wear it down more," Sophie said. "It's nicer." "Sophie," Mason said. "It's true," Sophie said. "I'm being helpful." Victoria looked at Mason over Sophie's head with the expression that had become, over the months, a kind of private language between them. The expression that said your daughter is extraordinary and also completely exhausting, and I mean both of those things entirely as compliments. "She's not wrong," Victoria said. "She's rarely wrong," Mason said. "It's a lot." The room filled in around them over the next hour. Parents, mostly. Some with children, some without. People who had applied through the Foundation's portal in the 6 weeks since the soft launch, and who had been invited to this event as the first cohort of families the fund would support. 14 families in the first cycle. 14 was not a large number. Victoria had said, in the planning meeting where the number had been determined, that 14 families done correctly was more valuable than 40 families done inadequately, and Mason had agreed, and that had been the end of that particular conversation. He stood near the back of the room and watched the families come in, and he thought about himself 11 months ago. Not himself standing here, but the version of himself that had printed boarding passes on a cracked phone and run through Terminal C and chosen the cheapest seats and carried the arithmetic of everything in the background of every other thought. That version of him would not have been able to imagine this room. Not the Foundation itself, not the people in it, just the simple fact of being in a room where the problem he'd been carrying alone had a name and a structure and other people who understood it from the inside. He thought about what it cost to be that alone, and he thought about the specific weight of it, and he thought about how the weight didn't announce itself because it was always there, and always present things stop announcing themselves. He thought about Sophie in the car at 5:30 in the morning, drawing by feel in the dark, saying maybe persistent and brave are the same thing. He thought they probably were. Victoria found him at the back of the room an hour into the event, after she had spoken and answered questions and talked to each of the 14 families in turn, with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely listening rather than performing listening. She came to stand beside him in the way she'd learned to stand beside him, close enough that it was deliberate, far enough that it was still a choice rather than an assumption. They were still in the threshold they'd been standing on since the sidewalk outside the restaurant. Neither of them had pushed through it, and neither of them had stepped back from it either. "How many applications in the portal?" he asked. 211, she said, "as of this morning." He looked at the room. 14 families, he said. Not as criticism. She knew it wasn't criticism. 14 this cycle, she said. The endowment structure supports 35 next cycle if the investments perform where we've projected. She paused. If they outperform, more. And if they underperform? Then I write a personal check, she said, and we figure out the next cycle after that. He looked at her. Is that a real answer or a board meeting answer? Real, she said. I haven't given a board meeting answer in 4 months. I'm trying to stop having 2 different registers. He thought that was one of the braver things he'd heard in recent memory, though he didn't say it in those words because she would deflect it, and he'd rather she just kept doing it. Mason, she said. Yeah. She turned slightly to look at him, not performing anything, not building toward anything, just looking at him with the directness that was her actual default when she wasn't managing distance. I'm glad you didn't move, she said. On the plane. I know it hurt your neck. He had told her at some point during one of the phone calls that his neck had ached for 2 days. He hadn't intended it as significant information, just as the texture of what had actually happened, and she had filed it in the specific way she filed things that mattered. My neck is fine, he said. Still, she said. He looked at the room. The 14 families, the foundation board, Sophie at the front near the windows talking to a girl about her age with the focused social intensity of someone who has decided a new friendship is available and is going to make it happen. Sophie had written something in the purple notebook and was showing it to the girl. From this distance, he couldn't see what it was. He suspected it was the heart diagram, the one with the arrow. This one, the important one. I didn't think about it, he said. Not moving. It wasn't a decision. I know, Victoria said. That's the part that mattered. He looked at her. The spring light was doing something to the room that afternoon light in early March does when it manages to come through correctly. Not golden, nothing so theatrical, just the honest light of a season trying to begin, landing on things without editorializing. He thought about his wife, who had been gone for 19 months now, and about the specific shape of the life he'd built in her absence, and about how the building had been done out of necessity rather than design, and had produced something that was sturdy in its improvised way, but that had been, for a long time, very quiet. He thought about Sophie saying you should go. She doesn't talk to many people, like really talks. He thought that he was probably one of those people too, who didn't talk to many people, who had been moving through the world with his hands full and his head down and his attention narrowed to the things that couldn't be dropped, which was the right response to the situation, but which had also meant that somewhere along the way, the world had gotten smaller without his noticing. The world was slightly larger now. He was still figuring out what to do with the extra space. The girl Sophie's talking to, Victoria said. Her name is Imogen. Heart defect, different type. She's 10. Her mom is the woman in the red jacket near the coffee table. She paused. I read every application myself. Every one. He believed her. Victoria, he said. Yeah. Thank you, he said. For all of it. The foundation and the procedure and all of it. She was quiet for a moment. You know what I'm going to say? That you should be thanking me, he said. That we're even, she said. We're close enough that keeping track doesn't make sense anymore. He thought about that, about the economics of gratitude, which didn't actually work like economics, which didn't balance the way ledgers balance, which operated on a different logic that had more to do with who you became in relation to other people than with any accounting of specific exchanges. He thought about a woman who had fallen asleep on his shoulder and a scarf on a floor, and an 8-year-old who had spoken into a terminal at midnight because she had seen something and silence was a choice, and she had been taught that. He thought about Claire, who had raised a daughter in the years she'd had with her who could do that, and who had left him with the ongoing task of continuing the work, which was the hardest and most important thing he'd ever been asked to do, and which he had been doing, imperfectly and stubbornly, for 19 months. He thought that she would have had opinions about the woman standing beside him. He thought they would have been, on balance, favorable. He thought that and held it carefully, and then let it be what it was. A thought, a true one, not a permission and not a burden, just a true thing. Sophie, across the room, looked up from the purple notebook and found his eyes the way she always found his eyes across rooms, the navigation of it so practiced it didn't require effort. She gave him the look that meant, "I'm fine," which also meant, "I see you," which also meant, "Everything is okay over here," which was Sophie's three-layer communication style that she had been deploying since she was 5, and that he had been reading since then with a fluency that only came from paying complete attention to someone for a long time. He gave her the look back that meant good. She went back to the purple notebook. He stood in the spring light at the back of the room and thought about the things that change you that you don't see coming, and about the things you do without thinking that turn out to matter, and about the specific and unrepeatable series of contingencies that had put him in a window seat next to an aisle seat on a night flight to Seattle 11 months ago. He thought about all of it, and then he let most of it go. The way you let go of things that have already done their work. And he stood in the present tense of a room full of people who needed help and were getting it, beside a woman who had learned to build with her hands again after someone had tried to take everything she'd made, and he was 32 years old and tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been carrying a great deal for a long time. And the tiredness was real, but it was not the whole picture. The room was real. Sophie was real. The girl named Imogen, who was now laughing at something Sophie had said, was real. 211 applications in a portal, and 35 families in the next cycle, and a needle through a valve in a heart that had kept going without knowing why it was supposed to. All of it real. He had not planned any of it. He had just not moved, once, on a plane, in the dark. It turned out that was enough to start.